This occurred at the last place that I lived about 4 years ago. I'd been renting a house from someone, and the place itself, as well as the neighborhood, were great. Everyone got along or kept to themselves, so no one bothered one another, and I enjoyed it. In fact, I was asked by my neighbor across the street to house sit for him while he was away for a few days for family matters. Greg was a cool guy, never gave off any weird vibes, and also never complained when I had parties with friends and family in the past. We never got too crazy or loud, but I did apologize when someone parked in front of his place. He was kind and said that we could even use his driveway if we needed, as long as we told him in advance. He had a garage where he parked his car, and I rarely saw him leave, so it made sense. Anyways, he asked if I could make sure his cat, Lucy, had food and water, to water his yucca that he had in the kitchen, and just do the normal checkups around the place while he was gone. And I agreed. He offered to pay me, but I declined. He lived across the street, so it wouldn't cost me anything to walk over there and be a helpful neighbor in return for the times that he's helped me. And before he left, he invited me over to walk through his place and gave me some basic instructions, as mentioned above. Even though I knew Greg, I'd only ever been in the doorway in the living room, so going in, I see his house looked pristine, and everything had its place. From the little knickknacks on a nearby table to the potted plant rotated to cause the plant to twist and curve perfectly into the start of an arch. It looked very homely and inviting. The first day went as normal. I got off work and went over to feed Lucy. She was also a very affectionate cat, so I spent a little extra time there petting her and playing with her before I left. That evening, maybe an hour or so after leaving, Greg texted me asking how things were and jokingly asked if Lucy was causing trouble. After responding with something simple, he mentioned that since she loved attention, I was welcome to spend as much time hanging out there with her as I wanted, and even reminded me where he kept her treats. It was kind of an awkward conversation, to be honest, as I was a full-grown adult. Maybe I was just being mean, but I didn't think I needed permission to pet a cat that I was watching. I thought maybe it just came through awkwardly in text, so I responded with something like, "Okay, thank you," and let it be. The next day I went back over before I started dinner, and my boyfriend called while I was there. We talked on the phone as I continued my task of caring for the cat. I mentioned needing to take a shower after dinner so I could sleep in the next morning, and my boyfriend tried being flirty with my comment. Just trying to give an idea of what happened while I was there and what was spoken out loud. So, after I finished there, I went home and enjoyed the rest of my night. But while I was making dinner, I got another text from Greg, again checking in. He followed it up with another weird statement, though. He said I was welcomed to use anything in his home, including his bathroom to take a shower if I needed to. Again, I thought that was weird because I lived across the street, not hours away. I had no reason to use his bathroom like that. I again just thanked him and left it at that. The third day, my boyfriend was staying the weekend at my place, so he came with me to take care of the house. We both played with Lucy while we sat in the living room chatting. Again, my boyfriend was getting a bit hands-on, but that was normal and all in good fun, but we did stop since we weren't in my place. After locking up and returning home, I was greeted by another message from Greg. This time, he said he appreciated my help, but that he didn't want any strangers in his house. I found the statement odd, as it wasn't like I was throwing a party at his place or something, so I just told him I understood and that it had only been me just to keep the peace. He seemed to question me about it, but then let it go. But that was what set alarm bells off for me. My boyfriend noticed the change in expression, so I showed him the message. He immediately suspected that my neighbor might have a camera somewhere, which would explain why he saw a stranger, which was my boyfriend. I didn't understand why he wouldn't just say that when he texted me, but I just let it go. If all went well, I would only have to do this for a few more days anyways. The next day, I went over there in the morning alone, and as I watered the plant, I started thinking about the weird conversations I'd had with Greg, and how my boyfriend suspected there was a camera. My initial thought was that it was out front, but then I became suspicious about him possibly hearing or seeing me in the living room. So I decided to test it. I rubbed my arm and mentioned to myself out loud that I needed to get more lotion. I finished there and went back home to my waiting boyfriend. Then my suspicion was confirmed, as I got a response from Greg directing me to where he keeps his lotions and creams if I needed some. I immediately became freaked out. Why would you have cameras and mics deep inside your home like that? I could understand at the door. I have a Ring camera myself, but if you didn't trust the person enough, then why ask them to watch your house? I told my boyfriend what happened, and he agreed that it was weird, and he became pretty protective of me as well. Thankfully, I only had a day left, so I figured I would push through it, and decline to help in the future if I was going to be so heavily watched. My boyfriend, however, said he wanted to go with me regardless of what he said to make sure I was safe. It was sweet, but I told him while the cameras were weird, they weren't going to hurt me. But he was adamant. He said he felt like he needed to go even if he just sat outside while I went in, so I agreed with this plan. So, while he sat on the bench in the front, I went in to take care of things one last time. While refilling Lucy's water bowl, something caught my eye. There was a spoon in the sink. I hadn't used any of his utensils. I had no reason to, so why would it be there? I immediately became suspicious, and went out front to tell my boyfriend to come in. After explaining this to him, he immediately went in and started looking around the place. I watched from the living room as he opened the doors and looked in the rooms. First he checked the bathroom, then the first room on the right, and then he tried the second door. I watched him struggle with it, so I assumed it was locked until he started yelling. He demanded that they identify themselves, but the other person didn't respond. Then, my boyfriend slammed against the door, causing it to open. I ran over to him, and what I didn't expect to see was Greg on the other side of the door. His face was red, and I could see the veins bulging from his neck. I was terrified and confused, and even more so when his only comment was, "I told you I didn't want anyone else here but you." I tried asking what he was doing at home or why he didn't tell me he was back early, and he couldn't answer. He just kept stammering, and would just go back to blaming me for bringing my boyfriend. We both left and went home, discussing what the hell we had just witnessed. We came up with two different scenarios. Either he got home early and hadn't informed me yet, and maybe us being there scared him so he hid. The only door that I noticed that locked was the bathroom, so maybe that's why he was leaning against the door or preventing it from being opened. However, with the cameras and the weird comments, my boyfriend thinks that he's been home this whole time, and was just being a creep about it. He became really angry about it, knowing that if that was the case, I'd been going there alone. and he was worried about what he could have tried. What if I did use his shower? What would have happened? I completely understood his concern, but it was overwhelming to think about. I didn't know if anything could be done, or at least to make a complaint or statement about what had happened, so I did go to the police station and ask. As expected, since neither of us were hurt, and we were in his house, there was nothing they could do, because he could choose to put cameras in his house if he had wanted. So, instead, I took it into my own hands. I basically told him to never talk to me again, and just blocked his number. And whenever I met with or talked to other neighbors, I made sure to tell them about my uncomfortable experience house-sitting for him. I would occasionally see him outside, but he rarely talked to the neighbors anymore. He had other male friends over on occasion, though. I moved in with my boyfriend a year later, but I still think about it on occasion. I'm just glad that I was never really in any embarrassing positions while I was over there, or used his bathrooms, because I never did see where he hid those cameras. In the fall of 2017, I had just started a new job that required me to commute about an hour there and back. It was a decent job, and the drive didn't really bother me that much, even though 2 hours on the road a day can be a bit tiring. I've always enjoyed driving. It gives me time to think about things, listen to some new music or podcasts, just spend some time with myself and all that. My daily route consisted mainly of a long stretch on a state highway. Not an interstate or anything, just a 2-lane stretch for a while. It was pretty straightforward in the morning, but in the evenings, it was a completely different story. If I left too late, the highway would be dark, poorly lit, and oftentimes empty. It was just me and the road. Peaceful, sure, but also kind of creepy. One Friday night, I had to stay late at the office to get some stuff done before taking a few days off. So I was there pretty late. It was a long week already, and I was ready to crash and just take a few days to myself. The highway was unusually deserted, like straight up ghost town vibes. I looked at the clock and it read 10:17 p.m., which was way later than I thought it was. My car's headlights were pretty much the only source of light cutting through the dark highway ahead. Now, I don't scare easily, but I've seen enough horror movies that start on empty roads at night to feel that chill up my spine. About halfway through the drive, I was just cruising at speed, enjoying the cool air and belting out some of the tunes, when my eye caught something. It was one of those, oh hell, is there something in the road, and do I need to swerve to miss it kind of moments. Which quickly turned into, that's a car sitting across 2 lanes with its lights off, and if I don't swerve, I'm going to hit it. When that clicked, I immediately shifted over to the left lane to not hit the car. As I got closer to the car, I started thinking about how weird it was that there was just a car sitting on the highway like that. I mean, cars break down sometimes, sure, but people will normally do anything they can to not have their car sitting in the lanes like that in the middle of the night. And while that was weird, it got weirder. As I passed it, I glanced over to see if there was someone in the car, and there was. So this guy was sitting in his car with the headlights off, blocking 2 lanes. As I passed it and made eye contact with the driver, I could feel the tension in the air, which only grew when I saw the headlights click on. and then watched the car pull out onto the road behind me. My gut was screaming that this was not a good situation. A car blocking the road in the dark turns on its headlights and decides to chase you after you pass. It really makes for one hell of a night. My heart was pounding, the hair on my arms was standing up. I pressed down on the accelerator and kept my eyes on the road, thinking that I was just being paranoid. There was no way this guy was actually following me, right? This was just a coincidence, surely. I decided to test this theory, and I took the next exit. But I stayed in the straight lane so that I could get right back on the highway. Surely if he wasn't following me, even if he did take the same exit, there was no way that he would be getting back on the highway like that. I got to the right to exit, got to the light, and kept going straight, immediately getting back on the highway. And, much to my horror, he did the same thing. At this point, I was certain that this guy was tailing me, and for what, I really didn't know. Suddenly it hit me. There was a service exit coming up, one that led to a series of complicated back roads. If I took it, maybe I could lose him. With seconds to spare, I swerved to that exit. My tires screeched, and I almost lost control of my car. I looked back, and I saw him swerving quickly as well. But by doing this, I actually gave myself a little bit of distance. The back roads were even darker than the highway, lined with dense woods and absolutely no streetlights. I took the turns way sharper than I should have, went way faster through the forest-lined streets, and, after a while, I knew that I'd gotten enough distance to actually get away. I turned off my headlights, took one last turn into someone's gravel driveway, and did a U-turn on their property. Which, sorry, I don't think I did any damage, but if I did, I apologize to that person. I just sat there, holding my breath, and waiting for the car to pass. And, like clockwork, it did. I watched as it kept going past the driveway where I was hiding. I waited for a few more minutes just to make sure he didn't come back, but I also didn't want to freak out the person that owned the driveway where I was hiding. As soon as I was certain that I was good, I pulled out and went back the way that I had come from. The rest of the way home, I kept my eyes half on the road, half on my rearview mirror to see if he ever showed up again. I was rigid, thinking that at any second he was going to randomly pop back up behind me, which thankfully never happened. When I got into my driveway, I bolted out of my car and into the front door, only really feeling that sense of safety and relief when it was shut and locked. In the end, I feel like this was some sort of trap. They were blocking the road to get the person to slow down or stop, and then they would do God knows what. But then, when I didn't slow down or stop, the guy gave chase. It bothers me that he didn't care that I knew he was following me, because that meant that he didn't think he was going to lose me. But thankfully, I somehow weaseled my way out of the situation. I wanted to call the police by this point. I really didn't know what to tell them, though. Just say that some weird guy followed me for a while on the road, but that I lost him. I felt like if I had called them, there wouldn't have been much they could do, so I didn't. Call me stupid, I guess. I don't care. Now, whenever I have to drive home at night, I'm super vigilant and watch everything like a hawk. I also never leave that late. I don't care how much work I have left to do. And, thankfully, I haven't encountered anything else like that on the ride home. So, I want to start this story out by saying that I'm a fairly serious person. I never wanted to be a stiff, but As I've gotten into my late 20s, now early 30s, I kind of shifted into this very serious person that was always busy with work and career ambitions. My friend, Sarah, on the other hand, has always been a very whimsical person that does everything based on how she feels in that moment. And she doesn't like to be tied down. You know that one meme with the two girls, where one's wearing all black with black hair, and the other one's wearing tie-dyed clothes and has rainbow hair? Yeah, that's us. There's one thing that we have always agreed and have loved together, though, and that's Spooky Month. We both have this strange love for October, the hallowed season, and all things scary. There's just something about the change in seasons where the air gets crisp and starts to sting a bit that can pull me out of my serious demeanor and bring Sarah a bit closer to my state of thinking. But Sarah is still the let's do this crazy thing right here, right now kind of person, and she's my best friend. So, I'm more than willing to let her convince me to do something stupid, especially when she comes to me super excited about it. It was obviously her idea to investigate something that she'd heard about from her brother. On the outskirts of our town, there was, apparently, an old abandoned farm that had an old barn that was still standing. There was, as there always is, rumors about this farm. This one was actually pretty messed up, and true. Apparently in the 60s, the patriarch of the house came home one day, and something made him snap. He murdered his whole family and then himself. She mentioned this, and the only thing I could think of was holy Amityville horror. I was a bit apprehensive at first, but she convinced me that we wouldn't be going into the house where the crimes happened. We would just do a quick walk through the barn to see what was there. So, armed with a flashlight and a sense of daring, we set out one Friday night to explore the barn, and perhaps get a bit of a scare in preparation for the rest of the spooky month. We got to the location, and she parked off to the side of the road in a spot that was completely unnoticeable by anyone driving by, and we started walking onto the property. The barn was actually a pretty massive structure, much larger than I anticipated. And, as we entered, Sarah had this brilliant idea. She pulled her phone out and placed it on a ledge, and told me she was going to record to see if she could get any ghostly sounds. We continued on into the large wooden relic. The building was weathered for sure. Windows were boarded up. The paint was peeling away as if the walls were growing fingers and trying to reach into the darkness. We walked through the main, hall. I'm not really sure what to call the area where the stalls are for the various animals, and I will say that I was feeling very uncomfortable within a few moments. It was unusually freezing in that building. The air was stale, and everything was layered in dust, which I knew was going to kill my allergies. Then, Sarah stopped in the middle of the floor and put her hand back to stop me, and said, "Kay, did you see that?" I looked around. I hadn't seen anything, and I told her as such. She then pointed her flashlight up towards where the loft in the back was, saying that she thought she saw something moving up there. I figured she was just trying to creep me out a bit, and it was absolutely working. She glanced over at me and asked if I wanted to go up there to check it out. I was very hesitant. I started to tell her that I didn't want to, but as soon as I opened my mouth, I heard what sounded like someone talking. Not like a person that was nearby, but like something whispering something in the distance. Based on how pale Sarah got, I could tell that she heard it too. But she went a different route with her fear and started to chuckle uncontrollably. She jumped up excitedly and said that we needed to get up there ASAP to see what creepiness there was. She ran over to the ladder and started climbing it, leaving me with zero chance to tell her that I did not want to go up there. So I followed her. Up in that loft was, well, it was genuinely unsettling. There were toys, a lot of them. All of them older and dirty, like they'd been there for decades. Probably because they had. As she swept the area with the flashlight, she pointed it towards what looked like a small bundle of blankets in the corner, and in the blankets was a doll. But not like a normal doll. This thing was clearly handmade, poorly sewn together. The smile on its face almost felt malicious. It was sewn on at a weird angle. The button eyes were partially broken, and the clothing on the doll was stained with God knows what. Sarah reached over and picked the doll up to look a bit closer at it. This is where things went from creepy to, well, creepier. I turned to look around the room a bit more, looking at the other toys, the various bits of clothing that were stacked in the corner, and after a few seconds, Sarah let out a chilled scream, and I turned just in time to watch her throw the doll down and immediately dash down the loft's ladder. I followed her down to the main level, and she took off out of the barn. And thankfully, I remembered her phone and grabbed it before we left, only to see her continuing her jog out to the car. When we got to the car, I could see that she was breathing heavily and her eyes were watering. This was a stark contrast to the excitement she'd shown going up into the loft. I asked her what was wrong and what had happened as I handed her her phone, and she just shook her head and said, "We can talk about it when we get home." I didn't push it. She was clearly in a bad way, so I just put the car in reverse and took the roads back home. When we got back to my place, she finally settled down and told me what had happened. When she picked up the doll, she started to feel nauseous, like she was going to get sick. She said that I had turned away and she saw me looking over at the other things, and when she turned to look back at the doll, she saw a little girl's face just behind the doll in her hands. She told me that the face was grotesque, that she wasn't just a pretty little girl. She looked like she'd been severely beaten and injured. And the look that she gave Sarah was one of rage, like she was mad that Sarah was holding the doll. That's when she let out the yelp, tossed the doll, and ran away. That in and of itself was creepy, sure, but as we talked through it, Sarah recalled the audio recording on her phone. She grabbed her phone and we listened to see if it caught anything, and there were 2 instances that sent chills up my spine. The first was not too long after we got to the barn, and she set up the phone. There was what clearly sounded like a little girl's voice saying, "She's pretty. I hope she'll play with me." It was whispery and quiet, but that's what I swear I heard. Then, the second bit was a bit later, and it was actually right before Sarah gave her yelp. You could hear us talking in a hushed tone, and then there's a really staticky sound, like the wind was blowing over the phone. And I swear there was an angered and slightly demonic-sounding voice saying, "That's mine." And then you hear Sarah let out her scream and run out of the barn. This would have aligned right with when she said she saw the girl's face, and I'm guessing that was the girl staking her claim on the doll, even from beyond the grave. The whole event was more than enough for me. I was properly terrified. We never went back to the barn, and we decided to not really talk much about the whole event beyond that night. Thankfully, nothing attached itself to us, or followed us out of that barn, but I would be lying if I said I didn't think that was what was going to happen. It was a terrifying experience, one that even now, a couple of years later, I can remember with vivid detail. I can recall the cold feeling, the overall unsettling aura that was about the place, and that look on Sarah's face after she threw that doll. Thankfully, she hasn't had the idea to go into any more abandoned buildings, but October is only a couple of weeks away, so I'll let you know if that changes this year. Frankly, I'm not sure if this is even the right place to post such a thing, especially due to the name of the subreddit, which in this case was r/the truth is here, but this has been on my chest for quite a while now. So I'd appreciate it if you could hear out my vent and give your advice. Honestly, I've been struggling with the question of life and death since the time I was born. The funny thing is, though, I can remember the moment that I popped into existence better than I remember my life. It was like it was literally yesterday. My first ever memory, I believe, was the color gray or white. I think it was a bright flash of light, but I also think it was gray or something. It's sort of the color you get when you look at a petri dish under a microscope. The second was darkness. I was floating around what I would personally call space, but there weren't any astronomical objects. No lights, no stars, and I distinctly remember my first thoughts. Where am I? What is this? Is this what death is like? What language am I speaking? How am I thinking? What the hell is this? Before I could finish that last question, I tried breathing but couldn't, even though I didn't need to. So I started panicking as suddenly I started to feel like I was moving with increasing speed outside of my will. I began seeing lights that looked like stars from the night sky pass by me, as if I was moving way faster than the speed of light. After I don't even know how much time, but it felt like seconds or a minute passed, I suddenly just hit Earth. It was literally like hitting something in a car crash or a roller coaster, except that I didn't feel anything. Everything just suddenly became dark. Not the same type of dark as when I popped into existence, but the same kind as the transition when you go to sleep. I remember having a series of weird dreams and popping in during random moments of my life. One of the first dreams I experienced was me sitting on the toilet with all my family surrounding me and some weird little creatures waiting outside the bathroom, who all looked at me with enthusiasm. I remember looking at my mother and wondering who the hell is that person, and suddenly I just knew that this is my mother. I remember that when I finished doing my business, I looked down the toilet and saw that the toilet was painted the color of my country's flag, to which, when I saw that, everyone erupted in cheers and joy. And then the dream cut off. I'll spare you the rest of the details since it was pretty much just random moments of my childhood, such as meeting people or random moments with my family. For example, I can recall seeing two childhood friends for what was to me the first time, but to them, and reality, had been many, many meetings. And I thought to myself, these are my friends. That being said, however, I distinctly remember gaining total control of myself at around my 3rd birthday. Whereas everyone was partying, I pretty much just woke up suddenly and began wondering who the hell these people are on my birthday. I myself didn't even know it was my birthday until it was time for the cake. Ever since then, I've really been pretty much the oddball for everyone. I didn't really have many friends, and everyone seemed to inherently dislike me for whatever reason. It was mysterious to me, but after 25 years of life, I'd say that my life is pretty good. and I'm at the point where I've met the love of my life, and I would say that I'm the happiest I've ever been. However, now that I'm happy, I simply can't shake the reality of my own mortality, and it's a topic that has been keeping me up at night for about nearly a month now. That all being said, I would like to share two paranormal experiences that I've personally had, since this is a paranormal subreddit. The first one was about when I was still a kid, around 4 or 5 years old or more, back at my villa that my grandfather built. I could always hear this, what sounded like a stereotypical witch's laugh. I could hear it as if it was coming from behind the window of the room, or from within the walls of the room that I was in. However, when I check it out, there would be nothing, nor would there be any traces of anything. I still frankly can't explain it, but we sold the villa, and I never bothered thinking about it until I began revising my life for any memories this month. The second encounter was fairly late, however. I would say around the age of 14 to 15, about a year after my grandfather died. It started at first with some weird activity. I felt like I was always watched. I heard noises from around the house. Once even, my door slammed open even though it was locked, and there was no physical way that it could have opened, unless someone unlocked it. I even saw as the handle went down, as if someone had literally hit the handle. And then whispers started as a faint noise, but they quickly grew into ear-ringing whispers. When I first heard it, I panicked, because it just wasn't normal. I went to wake up my parents, and the weirdest realization got me. I could outrun the whispers. It was as if the whispers came from a physical place, even though I couldn't see it, and even be able to pass through it. It was a tough night for me, as my parents thought I was crazy since they couldn't hear nor see anything, and I just shriveled near the wall and plugged my ears. Interesting fact, I could still hear those whispers as if I hadn't plugged my ears. They threatened to put me in the hospital if this happened again. The next 1 to 2 days, I couldn't stop thinking what it was, repeating in my mind every second of what happened, and I became more curious as to what it was than afraid. And sure enough, 1 to 2 days later at the same time at night, I began hearing the whispers. So I just laid on my bed, turned my head towards the wall, closed my eyes and tried to listen. It was as if thousands of people all tried to whisper into my ears different things in unknown languages. And as I listened, it just suddenly stopped. And it never happened again. The third encounter was in a dream, only a week or two after the whispers. In my dream was my deceased grandfather, who I saw in what appeared to be a dark, dimly lit stage. When I saw him, I simply felt such remorse and sadness from how I missed him and what I had done during my life, and how we never managed to say goodbye to each other, that I just dropped to his knees, hugged him, and began profusely apologizing for everything while crying like there was no tomorrow. I've never had such a dream before, or again since. That's pretty much it from me. Let me know what you think about my life story rant, and let me know if you've got any ideas as to what this puzzle is. I have a story that's pretty intense, and honestly shakes me right to my core when I think about it. It was a Saturday night, around midnight. I had just finished hanging out with some friends and was driving home. I've never been one to drive on the highways, so I was taking the back roads through the neighborhoods to get home. I live in a pretty suburban, edging into rural part of the state, so it was a mix of houses and small neighborhoods, intertwined with various patches of woods and trees. I have to drive a bit slower to get through the neighborhoods, because there are a lot of winding curves. But in my opinion, it's the safer route, because it's typically pretty empty on the roads that time of night. Plus, it's just really peaceful. I was making my way through the winding paths, about 2/3 of the way home, when I see another set of headlights behind me. No big deal. Just another car driving on the roads. Nothing out of the ordinary. Or so I thought. It took me a while to notice, but this car was coming up on me fast. Too fast. Like, way too fast. They were approaching, but the lights were getting bigger and brighter at a pace that was at least 2 or 3 times what I was going. And I was going around 30 to 40. I slowed down a bit and pulled over to the side, watching as this car rockets past me and thinking to myself, that idiot is going to get himself killed. It was a reckless move that had bad news written all over it, and it made my stomach drop watching him go way too damn fast around those roads. As I continued on my way, a wave of dread washed over me. You know that gut feeling you get when something is off? Like that feeling you get when your boss calls you into their office and you think, I'm about to get fired? That feeling. I knew the path ahead, and it was not a straightaway. There were a number of twists in this section of my town, and it was mostly wooded out here, so I guess the word underdeveloped would be fitting. I drove cautiously, half expecting to see the inevitable result of that kind of reckless driving, just thinking that this was going to be a nightmare for everyone involved. Sure enough, less than 5 minutes after that initial encounter with that car, I rounded a small part of the road and my headlights landed on exactly what I was terrified to see. There was that car, completely wrecked and slightly burning. I knew as soon as I saw it that it was the exact same car that had passed me. I slammed to my brakes and hit my hazard lights, and then grabbed my phone and called 911. I stammered out that there had been an accident, told them the nearest crossroads, and told her that the car looked like it might be on fire. She told me to calm down, and explained that emergency services were on their way. But I knew deep down that time was ticking, and if the driver was still in that car and still alive, then they wouldn't be for very long. I told the dispatcher that I was going to check on the driver, and at first she was hesitant to say that I should. But I mentioned that if the driver was stuck or bleeding, then they may not have the time to wait, and she seemed to agree. I left the call going and put my phone in my pocket, and then grabbed the small emergency hammer from the glove compartment. It was the kind that has the window breaker with the seatbelt cutter, a tool that I never thought I was going to need, but at this moment was thankful to have. I ran over to the car and realized that the fire was definitely starting to catch on the ground, as well as the vehicle itself. The car was so badly damaged that it was nearly unrecognizable, but my gut was telling me that I needed to help this person, that if they were alive, then I needed to do something. I circled to the driver's side, shaking but determined. I was able to make out the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat, but he was out entirely. My heart sank at that moment, thinking that I was too late. I put my hand on his shoulder, and I started to talk to him in a loud but calm tone, asking if he could hear me. It took a few moments, but he did eventually open his eyes and slowly came to, asking what had happened. I was honestly shocked that this man was still alive. I asked him a couple of questions, mostly about if he could feel his legs, move his toes, things like that, and he told me he could. He was talking, able to move all of his body, so I knew that I needed to move forward with helping him out. At this point, the fire was starting to spread out, which was making me feel nervous, thinking that whatever time we had was absolutely minimal. I told him that we needed to get him out of the car, and he obviously agreed. I handed him the hammer tool and told him to cut the seatbelt off. He grabbed it and sliced it in 2 spots, forcing it to break loose and his body to shift. I was able to get my arms under him and told him that I was going to pull him out through the window. He pushed with his legs, I pulled, and after a bit of a struggle, we were able to get him out onto the ground. I asked if he could stand, and he said he could, so I slowly helped him get to his feet, and was able to get him over to my car so he could sit on the ground and let it support him. I turned back when I knew he was safe, and I watched as the car became mostly engulfed, and the tree that he'd hit went up around the same time. I'm pretty sure we were moments away from this guy's imminent death. Around that same time, I heard the wailing of sirens approaching, and a wave of relief washed over me. The emergency crews took over the scene, battling the flames and tending to the man. The paramedics got him up on a stretcher and got him to the ambulance. I had to give my statement to the police, still in a state of shock over the whole thing. My mind was on the man, thinking about whether or not he'd make it. He seemed mostly okay, but I had no idea how much of that was adrenaline. And I know that if he did have a head or neck injury, me getting him out of that car may have actually made it worse. Unfortunately, it was either that, or just sit by and watch this man get burned alive. The medics took him away. The officers asked me a few more questions. The firefighters got the blaze under control, and I just sort of stood there. I was trembling, and honestly, I couldn't help but think about my own mortality in that moment. How fine of a line it is between being alive and, well, being trapped in a car that's upside down and burning. Yes, it was his decisions that ultimately put him in that position, and yes, it was stupid to think he'd be safe going that fast around curvy roads, but no, he did not deserve to die for that decision. We all make stupid mistakes, and they shouldn't all be a death sentence. Ultimately, all I can do is pray that people realize they are not invincible, that one wrong move can be what crosses that fine line. Keep your wits about you when you're on the road. Be cautious, be careful, and be attentive. And please, use caution when you're operating your 2-ton death machine. It happened in my bedroom, at the age of 10. I always had trouble sleeping and spent most nights tossing and turning. I was a horror film fanatic as a child, and being scared was something I didn't have much experience with. I was not afraid of the dark, nor was I easily swayed by strange sounds or odd encounters. I did, however, know when to haul back end out of the situation, or to find a trusted adult. I always slept with my closet doors open, which will come to be some significance later in the story. I should also mention that my family home was in a heavily wooded area, in what some may refer to as the middle of nowhere. One night, around 1 a.m., I awoke to a sound coming from underneath the bed. It sounded like one of my cats was scratching themselves with one of their feet, or doing something to cause a thumping beneath me. I'd heard this same sound many times before, and its source had always been one of my fuzzy friends. So, this time, I didn't look. I closed my eyes and tried to resume my slumber. I turned over onto my left side, which left me facing the wall which my bed was pressed up against. I heard the sound again, thinking that my kitty was directly beneath me. I said goodnight, and I was able to fall asleep once again. The next time I awoke, it was to a surreal and shocking scene. The sheet and comforter of my bed were no longer covering me. I saw a man standing over my bed and poking me. Just poking me with his finger. And the way in which he did so was truly horrifying. It was not the way that a child would poke at a friend in jest. It was as if he was touching another human being for the first time, exploring the sensation of the tip of his index finger jabbing at flesh. What I saw was so unbelievable, so impossibly strange, that I believed I was dreaming. I tried desperately to awake from my nightmare to no avail. The poking continued. He poked at my chest, my belly, my legs, my arms. Paralyzed and scared witless, I yelled, "Wake up!" And with this, the man threw himself to the floor and closed his eyes. It was as if he was trying to lead me to believe that he was asleep or dead. I have no freaking idea. It was at this time that I realized I could not have been dreaming. I somehow found the ability to move, and I jumped from the top of my bed over the man lying on the floor next to me and ran towards my parents' room. When I got to their bedroom door, something came over me. I told myself that it was all impossible, that there was no way a person could have entered our home without breaking in, as we had always kept every door and window locked at night. I'd seen many strange things in my home whilst either falling asleep or waking up. By the third or fourth time, after speaking to my mom or dad about it, I knew that it was my mind playing tricks on me. Plush toys do not have the ability to turn and whisper into each other's ears. Do not ask why, dear reader, as I have no explanation to offer you, but I turned away from my parents' bedroom door and decided to hastily check the house for a break-in. What I found was that nothing was out of the ordinary. No broken windows or locks, no busted doors, nothing. I assured myself that I had to have been dreaming or hallucinating, and blamed my obsession with horror for this. I made my way down the long, dark, and narrow hallway to my bedroom. I peeked inside and saw no one. I turned on the light, got down on the floor just outside the doorway, and looked under the bed. Nothing. I proceeded to check both of my windows for signs of a break-in, which were not present. Both windows were closed and locked. I knew it. I was totally seeing things. I crawled back into bed and decided to watch some TV in order to calm myself down and distract from thoughts of the scary as hell dream or hallucination I had just had. I turned on the TV, flipped to a channel with a seemingly boring program, this always helped me become sleepy, and put the remote control on my bedside table. I was lying on my right side, facing away from the wall that I mentioned previously. As I laid there, my eyes began to adjust to the dark room with the faint light from the TV screen. Just beyond the TV, I saw something that made my heart sink into the pit of my stomach. Inside my closet, with one of the doors now slightly closed, I saw the man standing perfectly still, facing the wall, hiding. Waiting for me to fall asleep, I imagine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I sat and stared at the man in my closet for what seemed like minutes, but it was likely only a few seconds. I quietly got out of bed, hoping that the man wouldn't notice and that my dad could catch him hiding in the closet. I once again made my way to my parents' bedroom door, still remaining as quiet as I possibly could, and went inside. I shook my dad and my mom at the same time, and when they awoke, I said, "Shh, don't make any sound. There's someone in my closet." My parents both jumped up and said, "What?" I repeated myself and asked them to please call 911. My mom immediately picked up the phone. Neither of my parents doubted my claim, as I had always been honest and forthright. They both knew that there was no way I was making this up, or that I was mistaken. I'm sure that the look I must have had on my face made it clear that this was really happening. My dad told my mom and I that he was going to look, and urged us to stay in their bedroom and lock the door. So, we did. At this point, I was beyond scared. I didn't know what the man was capable of, whether he had a weapon, or whether my dad was safe. I just stood in the room with my mom and cried. After what felt like hours, my dad knocked on the door and told me it was him, and that it was okay to open the door. My mom unlocked the door and let my dad inside. I said something to the effect of, "Did you get him?" And my dad looked at me with the most unsettling and confused look imaginable. He said, "There's no one there." I assured him that there was indeed a man in my room, and that he'd been poking me. My dad said that he had just checked every inch of the house and found no one. He had also checked the doors and windows, just as I had done. Then, it hit me. He must have had a key. As soon as I said this, my parents looked at each other in absolute terror. Our nearest neighbor, a trusted and beloved friend whom we considered family, was in possession of a key to our house, as she had regularly babysat me since I was a toddler. She was the only person outside of my immediate family with the key to our home. Soon after this revelation, the police arrived, took statements, checked around our property, and left. None of us got any sleep that night. The next day, my dad went to the neighbor's house and asked if she knew where her key to our house was. She said yes, and when she went to show him, she saw that it was missing. Her home had no signs of a break-in, and she had always kept her doors and windows locked. My parents had all the locks on our doors changed, and opted to never again give a key to anyone, except in the wake of an emergency. I never discovered the identity of the man that lurked in my bedroom that night. The event left me traumatized, and it took a very long time for me to accept what had happened and moved on. My sleeping trouble turned into full-on insomnia, and for about a decade, I wasn't able to sleep without a light on. It's been 20 years since that night, and apart from my parents, I have never told a soul about it until now. I've actually found writing this to be very cathartic, and I'm glad that I stumbled across Let's Not Meet. My heart goes out to anyone who has suffered a trauma in their lives, and I hope that you are all able to find peace within yourselves. My buddy Jake and I have always been the adventurous types. We've been best buds since high school. We even went to college together. Our freshman year of college, we made a pact that while we attended college, in the spring between semesters, we would go on a road trip to a place that we had never been. Basically, we planned to go on 4 road trips together. And that way we would have memories together, and if life ended up pushing us in different directions, we would never forget the time we spent. Obviously, we treated each other more like brothers than just friends. Our last year of college, we decided that we would go towards the southwest, and had planned a destination that would be about as far as we could go without being gone too long. We had a pretty simple plan. Drive during the day, find a cool spot to camp at night. We had a tent, but we just kind of figured that we would end up sleeping in the car for convenience. There was a lot of driving where pretty much nothing had happened. We got some really great pictures, went to a few landmarks and all that. We got to Arizona, which was the end of our route, and after a long drive through, we decided that we would find as secluded a spot as we could in the desert. It was the last night out on the roads, so we just wanted to enjoy the spring night out in the middle of nowhere. We found a good spot, one that was wide open and the stars were visible in every direction. We parked the car, reclined the seats, and we started to drift off. After a little bit, the overwhelming silence was broken by what sounded like hushed voices, someone speaking in low tones, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the hard ground. Jake and I looked at each other at the same time, him asking, "Yo, did you hear that?" I nodded. We may put on a false bravado when we're at home, but we're city boys more than anything, and the wide open like this was foreign, a bit intimidating, if you will. That, and I'm kind of a scrawny dude, so if someone was to try to overpower me with malicious intent, I'd be best off just letting them stab me. Being the guys that we were, we did get curious, and that curiosity got the best of us. And we decided that we would go and take a quick walk around to make sure that we weren't in a situation, basically. We quietly got out of the car with a couple of flashlights and started to walk out into the wilderness. It was wide open, so it wasn't like we wouldn't be able to see if there was someone just outside the car, but there wasn't anyone there. That said, we both were still hearing voices, like they were disembodied, or were coming from a speaker with surround sound or something. I just kind of stood there staring off at the horizon thinking, where's that coming from? When I noticed Jake walk past me and pointing over to a small hill. "I think it's coming from over there, man." While we were curious and wanted to check it out, we weren't dumb enough to walk. So we got back in the car and Jake pulled forward slowly to check out the area where he thought the sounds were coming from. When we got over the hill, we parked and both got out to see if there was anything nearby, and what we found was seriously creepy as hell. On the other side of the hill was what looked like a large pit, larger than a grave but about that deep, dug straight into the earth. And inside the pit were dozens of animal carcasses, all in varying states of decay. Some were freshly killed, their eyes were still open and staring in terror, and others were nothing but dirty bones. It was like this nasty, gruesome dumping ground. We were both horrified, both of us thinking, what the hell is this? We both turned to ask each other that same question, but as we turned, we both paused because we heard what sounded like a twig snapping. And when we went to look, we saw a person off in the distance, walking towards us. They weren't saying anything, they weren't hesitating, and they didn't look to be armed. But they were just a large and foreboding presence in the night walking straight toward us with a fairly intimidating gait. We jumped back in the car and we took off. As Jake was driving off, I kept my eyes in the rear view mirror and watched this person slowly walk towards the pit. Then they just stood over it as they watched us drive away. We didn't stick around to find out what this all was about. We drove non-stop to the next town over, where we went to talk to the cops. The officer that was on duty looked incredibly disinterested in what we were saying, but said that he would look into it. Something about how he said it made it seem like he genuinely didn't believe us. We left the station with our minds racing, trying to figure out what the hell we'd stumbled upon. To the best of my knowledge, it isn't a common thing for landowners to have mass graves for animals like that. And I'm pretty sure it's illegal to just kill random animals for the sake of killing them and dumping them. Part of me assumed that the person walking up towards us was the person that was managing the pit. But Who knows what he would have done to us if we tried to talk to him? Maybe we would have ended up in the pit with the other animals. I was 22 and living on my own for the first time when this happened. It was the mid-90s. I had just gotten off work around 11 p.m. To reach my apartment building, I could either walk on the sidewalk, lit with street lamps, decently trafficked, or cut across this communal garden, pitch black and set back from the street. I saved about 1 whole minute of walking time by cutting through the communal garden, but being young and stupid, a lot of the times I took the shortcut. That night, I got that weird feeling to not take the shortcut. I kept to the sidewalk, but there was no one else around. When I got past the garden, all of a sudden this large man pops up from its exit path. There is no way he could have been in front of me or just behind me as I was walking. I would have noticed him. The only logical explanation was that he'd been hiding in the pitch-black garden. A drunk who'd been sleeping it off, maybe? No. My body was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. I began walking faster. My dad had taught me to always carry my keys in my fist, with a key pointed out in case I needed to punch someone, so I had that. But I'm 5'4", and probably weighed 110 pounds. This guy was tall and big. My only chance was to outpace him. I'm speedwalking at this point, and I feel him matching my pace, getting closer. He's breathing heavily, and I feel this angry energy coming off of him. But my apartment building is right there. So, I put on a burst of speed. When I reached the entrance, 2 people are leaving and hold the door open for me and him. I don't know why I didn't tell them that I thought this guy was following me. My mind froze, and I was just trying to get inside my apartment. Plus, I was still trying to rationalize it. Maybe he was visiting someone in the building. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. Don't be paranoid. Besides, it only took a couple of seconds for them to be out the door. I had missed my chance. I'm climbing the stairs as fast as I can. It's a 3-story building, and I live on the 3rd floor. He's climbing the stairs too. It's still right behind me. I get to my floor, which has 4 apartments on the right side, where I live, and 4 on the left. I pass by apartments 1 and 2. He's still right behind me. I stop at apartment 3, where I live, and he stops in front of apartment 4, where I know that he does not live. He hasn't said anything. He's just breathing hard, and I think there's no way that I'm going to open my apartment door and have him push me inside and assault me, or worse. He also hasn't knocked on the door of apartment 4. It's worth noting that the apartments are U-shaped, with mine and my neighbor's door being very close together. So, I bang on my own apartment door as loud as I can, but I yell my neighbor's name. "Hey, Kevin, let me in." This startles the guy. Even more so when my own apartment door doesn't open, but Kevin's does. Kevin sees the guy standing right in front of his door and asks what he wants. The guy starts mumbling something about having the wrong apartment, but I have my own door open so fast that I'm inside my place in a flash, locking the door behind me. I grab my cordless phone to call the police, but I hear Kevin through the door telling this guy he needs to leave. The guy does. Kevin knocks on my door and asks if I'm okay. I thank him and say that I am, but inside I am still frozen, adrenaline pumping, scared. I thank him again and tell him to have a good night, and lock my door again. I have my phone in my hand, just ready to call the police, but I start trying to rationalize it again. What exactly happened? A guy followed me home, but then said he had the wrong apartment. Are the cops going to care about something minor like that? I try to calm myself down, but I'm also berating myself. Why didn't I run the instant I felt him following me? Why didn't I tell the people we passed when the front door opened that I thought I was being chased? Worse, why didn't I tell Kevin that the second he opened his door and saved me? He could have let me inside his apartment. We could have called the cops together. But because of my stupidity, everything felt so ambiguous and I was questioning myself. A couple of weeks later, I'm visiting my grandparents, and my grandfather is reading the paper. He tells me that a woman was attacked in the apartment building across the street from mine. It's the same guy. He had multiple convictions for sexual assault and had just recently been released on parole. So, once upon a time ago, when I had just turned 18, I decided I wanted to try out exotic dancing. All I had to do to get started was get a pair of heels. The only place to get the heels was 2 hours away by car. Me and my friend, who was 17 at the time, drove the 2 hours to get some heels. We went to 5 different stores, and we couldn't find the ones that I wanted, so we decided to stop at Wingstop to get dinner. Then go back to the first store we stopped at, and just get the heels they had there. We walked into the Wingstop, and this dude at the front counter started telling us his life story, not leaving anything out, which was a little off-putting. Then he asked where we were from, and we told him the county instead of telling him the exact town. He then proceeded to ask why we were so far from where we live, and my friend answered with, well, she's a stripper, and she's looking for heels. To which I elbowed her in the chest for exposing me. The dude proceeded to give us our food for free, and then called his mom to see if she had any heels. He then asked if we wanted to ride with him. We both said no, but he insisted, and I had just smoked some with my friend before going into Wingstop, so I wasn't thinking. I thought my friend was coming with us, but we pulled out of the parking lot without her, which petrified me. Especially when I realized I left my phone in my friend's car. I sat in that car as far away from him as possible. He pulled into an apartment complex and went inside. He came back out about 30 minutes later with a box of shoes. On our way back, he proceeds to ask me if he could hire me for private dances. He asked what club I was going to work at, and I lied and told him the wrong club. When we got back to my friend's car, he asked for my number. I was going to give him the wrong number, but he said he was going to call it to make sure it was the right number, so I gave him my number. Then he got in the back seat of my friend's car and tried to smoke with us. He had his own, but I wasn't about to smoke someone else's when he was being that sketchy. So I texted my cousin and told him to call me and tell me that my grandma was dying in the hospital. I'm not proud. The dude got out of the car and went back to work, and my friend pulled out of the parking lot, and we parked somewhere else so that we could eat our food. Also, on our way home that night, we almost got into a head-on collision, but we survived. A couple of mates and I decided to go on a road trip through the country towns of New South Wales, Australia. It was our first trip. We wanted to go during schoolies years ago, but due to the pandemic, we had to stay home and wait until we could do it. With our schedules clear of both personal and professional commitments, and with the long weekend, we were finally able to make the trip. Whenever we drove through any of the towns, we would look to see what was on, show up, stay the night, and keep driving. We literally had no plans. There was a small rustic cafe in the middle of the bush with beautiful views going by what we saw on social media. We made the drive there through a rough road. My friends and I joked about my friend's car not surviving the journey. On either side of the road was farming land, or part of one of the national parks. It was beautiful. We only saw maybe about 4 utes at most on the road. I noticed something that was kind of unsettling. There was smoke coming from one of the roads. There was some rain, and we all figured that they must have been backburning to prevent the drastic bushfires that Australia gets. We didn't see any signs or anything. Soon we saw the same thing on the other side of the road, and the anxiety of what could happen started to settle in. I imagine you're probably wondering why we didn't immediately turn around. 1, we're idiots. And 2, the fires were small. We debated calling the fireys to warn them. The utes and other off-road style cars didn't seem fazed by it. Either they were the resilient country types, or they were used to this. We kept going and made jokes about the everything is fine dog meme, the one where he's surrounded by fire in a house. There was more smoke than fire. As we kept driving along the road, we were going up a hill, and the fires looked larger. And it wasn't just smoke anymore. We actually saw flames. Keep in mind, there was mild rain, and it wasn't a roaring blaze. We kept going, and we couldn't see much anymore. It was hard to decide whether to keep going or to cut our losses and leave. Every so often, we would make our way out, and the smoke would clear up. We saw someone by the side of the road in their ute. My friend got out and asked what had happened. We found out that yes, they were back burning to prepare for the fire season. My friend asked if we were safe to drive through, and he said yes, but to do so cautiously. We definitely felt like city boys at this point. Unfortunately, the back burning got out of control, and the morning rain had long stopped. Driving through the road with fires on both sides is something I never want to do again. The scariest part was when a burning tree fell on the road, and we had to swerve in order to avoid hitting it. Since it was one of those small country roads, it didn't leave much room on the other side, and fortunately there were no cars going the other direction. This was the closest we had come to any of the fires, and it was scary how quickly it had spread. The fire brigade had to be called, and we were relieved when we saw the flashing lights and heard the sirens. We made our way out. The locals seemed mildly annoyed by it getting out of control, and the guy at the hotel said it wasn't that bad. Our story could have been a lot worse, and reading back through it, it doesn't sound as terrifying as some of the other stories. But I do have an increased respect for the fireys, and I suppose it was better to burn like this than waiting until summer and it being so much worse. I heard from the local townies that a couple of cars were hit by burning trees, and that someone's house had gone up in smoke because of the back burning going wrong. However, any of the injuries were minor, and no one had died either. I can only imagine what being in a bushfire would have been like, especially like the ones from a couple of years ago. Those were bloody deadly. Oh, yeah. The rest of the trip was fantastic. We got to see some really nice places and saw some historic pubs. Maybe I'll send in some more stories of what we got up to down the line. We got some awesome pictures too, but I'm not really comfortable sharing them with people on the internet. You have an awesome channel, Raven, and if you're ever down under, let me know, and we'll share a VB and have a yarn. Thank you. I have no idea what that means. I have a story that I wanted to share with you from back when I was a kid. This was in the early 2000s, back before I had a cell phone and landlines were still prevalent. I was about 13 with 2 younger siblings, and there were plenty of other kids in the same block. So, it was a normal occurrence to see kids playing outside, riding bikes in the streets, and the likes. One thing I liked to do was help out our neighbors with their pets, especially when they would go out of town. There was one house that was 2 houses down from us that belonged to Becky and Larry, and they had a blue heeler named Sassy. I loved playing with that dog, and when I was bored I would ask them if I could take her for a walk, and they would let me. She was incredibly well behaved, never even barked at others, and was super affectionate. They had asked me if I'd be willing to house sit for them while they went out of town for the weekend. It would just consist of me caring for Sassy and bringing in the mail. They also said I was welcome to walk her, and that I could help myself to the snacks and drinks they had, nor even watch the TV. I loved taking care of others' pets, partially because they usually paid me, and what preteen doesn't want their own money? But I also felt really grown up when I could house sit, as they would leave a copy of their key for me or tell me where they hid their spare. So, after school on Friday, I walked down to their house and let myself in to let Sassy out the back. That night was as normal as it gets. I sat in their home and played with the dog. I went home a few hours later and everything was fine. It was Saturday evening that things got weird. I told my parents I was going to go down there once more to let the dog out and decide to watch some TV to enjoy some time by myself. It was probably 7 or 8 p.m. when I saw what I thought was someone walking past the big front window. They had thin curtains on the window, and I left the porch light on, so I just saw a dark figure go past the window. I quickly went back to watching TV, however, not thinking much of it. Maybe it was just a shift of light, or maybe a glare from my glasses. But then came a knock on the door. I was curious at first because if it was my family, I figured they would just try to open the door, but all they did was knock. Being young, though, I just opened the door, still thinking that it may have been someone coming to get me. But I did not recognize the person at the door. It was a man, maybe in his 30s, wearing a workout jacket, with a collared shirt underneath it, and a scruffy but short beard. Not knowing what to say, I just looked at him, so he spoke first. "Hey there, is Mr. Larry home?" he said in a friendly tone while smiling at me. His demeanor and saying Larry's name lowered my guard a bit, thinking that he knew them, but maybe didn't realize they were out. I was still aware of some common stranger danger type of things, and I knew better than to say that I was alone or how long someone would be gone, so I told him that they had just stepped out for the night and would be back shortly, and denied that I was alone. The man smiled again and said, "Oh, I'm actually here to look at their cable box. They said they were having some problems with it." Now, I was a little suspicious at this point for a few reasons. First, I'd been watching TV all night with no issues. And second, they had a satellite dish on their roof. My family had cable at the time, and of course, that came with a big clunky cable box. And while I didn't quite understand all of that, I know that we didn't have a dish. So I don't think that they had cable. I told him that he should come back later when they were home because I didn't know where their box was, and he quickly responded with, "Oh, no worries. I'm actually a friend of Larry's. I know where it is. Don't worry, it won't take me too long." He then winked at me as he pushed his way past me and into their house. I was mentally freaking out at this point. This did not feel right, and I didn't know what to do. I was alone. Sassy was still out back. Not that I knew how protective she would be, since she was very friendly. He started looking around the living room and hallway like he didn't know where anything was. Not something I would expect from someone who claimed to be a friend. As my anxiety slowly rose more and more, he then asked without turning around to face me, "So, why are you here if they're just out for the night?" The way that he asked this was nagging at me, telling me that he obviously knew. He knew they weren't going to be back soon, and he knew I was alone. So, trying to think fast, as he looked over the TV in the cabinet with Becky's fancy dishes, I walked toward the back door replying, "I like their big dog," and opened it, with Sassy running in. I'm guessing Big Dog got his attention, and he quickly turned around. Thankfully, Sassy reacted just as I hoped. She ran in, stopped in her tracks when she saw this guy, and started barking like crazy at him. The guy froze in place and asked me to put the dog back outside, but I too froze behind Sassy, just letting her take control of the situation. The guy slowly walked back towards the door, and started stammering to say something, before he finally just left. When he was gone, I ran to lock the door as Sassy moved the curtains with her snout to look out and continued barking. I couldn't see him anymore, so I did my best to calm her down and led her back to the kitchen, enticing her with treats. She very quickly obliged. I called my house from their landline, letting my mom know what just happened. She told me to make sure the doors were locked and to stay on the kitchen floor so that I was out of view from the windows. She stayed on the phone with me, but I could hear her talking to my dad and then even heard the door open and close from the phone. When I heard my dad knocking on the door, I stood up and my mom told me that I could hang up now. I let him in and explained everything, and he told me to stay in the living room with the door locked while he looked around. He came back in, called my mom, and then the cops showed up shortly after. With everything going on, I was pretty scared and upset, thinking this was all my fault and that I was going to be in trouble for letting this random guy into our neighbor's house. After the cops were gone, we locked up the place and went back home. Both my parents had the opposite reaction than what I expected, however. Not that they were really mean or punishing anyways, but I at least expected a talking to about strangers. However, they both hugged me and said that I was very brave and smart to let Sassy in the way that I did, and then call them. They understood, and didn't doubt me when I explained that he practically pushed his way inside, and that I didn't let him in. They also explained to me the next day, probably to make sure I slept that night, why I handled that very well. When my dad came to get me, my mom called Becky and asked her about the guy. They confirmed that, 1, they did not have cable, so they did not call for maintenance, and assured that they wouldn't do that when they knew there wouldn't be anybody home, and 2, they didn't recognize anyone by the description that I gave. Mom then called the police at that point, and we talked to them from there. The cops did a few circles around our neighborhood, and even checked out their backyard and shed, but unfortunately the guy was nowhere to be found, and they never did. Becky and Larry were returning that Sunday, so my parents told them they would keep an eye on the place, and I wasn't allowed back over there by myself again, just in case he came back. But thankfully he never did. At that age, I was conflicted. Somewhere between being upset that I couldn't go by myself, but I also shuddered at the idea of him coming back. They returned, and we never heard about him or saw him again, but I still wonder what his true intentions were. Was it really just to case the place out to rob it? Or was there something more, since I just happened to be there? I'm a nurse at a palliative care unit in an old hospital. If you're a nurse at one of these units like me or know a nurse, please read until the end, as I could use your help. Throughout my years working at this hospital, I have seen a lot, especially being in a palliative care unit. You see a lot of things other people wish they wouldn't. For some of us, at some point, we have to just accept things as they are. The unit I work in has 9 beds in 9 different bedrooms, all spread along a long corridor. At the start of the corridor is the lift, and coming out of it, you would find the cleaning room on your right, where we keep all the cleaning equipment and products, and the nurse's room on your left, along with the entrance through the stairs. Because of the building and patient safety, and so we can access the other floors easily if in need, the administration forbade us from locking the stairs doors. This isn't ideal, because some of our patients, in their delusions, can go across our room's door unnoticed, and will be a danger to themselves. So, we always keep the doors closed by tying a bed sheet around the door handles to keep them together. This is important so you know why what comes next started out so strange. The nurse's room is where we'll spend most of the night shifts, doing all kinds of activities, including resting and actually sleeping. Usually late at night, my routine would include checking on all of our patients, checking on all the doors and windows to make sure they are all locked properly, checking on the doors to the stairs, and then spend most of the night checking patient files. This night in particular, I had finished with my rounds and was checking on all the cameras, when my nursing auxiliary came into the nurse's room. She asked me if anything else was needed, or if she was okay to sleep for a while. I told her she was fine to go to sleep, so she took her shoes off, laid down with her back to the room and me, facing the wall, and went to sleep. I was reading a new patient's file who was coming into our unit soon to know what to expect, and how to behave around him, when I started hearing footsteps walking up and down the unit's corridor. At first I ignored them, thinking I was just tired, and that my ears were playing tricks on me. It wouldn't be the first time. As they persisted, though, I started wondering what was going on. I took another look at the cameras, but each and every one of the bedrooms and corridor feeds seemed completely normal. The steps, though, kept coming all the way to the nurse's room, stopping about 2 steps away from showing at my door, and then turning around and walking back all the way to the opposite end of the corridor. I waited to see if anything changed, but when it didn't, I stood up to go check. And that's when one of our patients, the one in room number 7, started calling us frantically. The auxiliary nurse was still asleep, so I walked carefully out of the room, peeked out of the room, and looked around. There was nothing there, and the footsteps had stopped, so I rushed to the patient's room. When I got there, he was shouting frantically, huddling against the bed's headboard with what seemed like renewed energy, shouting at me to tell the man in the top hat sitting on the chair in the room to go away and leave him be. Usually with patients like these in a state of distress, we just go along with their delusions to calm them down. If there are nurses watching, which I hope there are, you'll know what I mean. In this case, with him screaming in the room, I turned towards the chair and started talking to this imaginary man in a top hat, telling him he needed to go, that the visiting hours were done, and that he needed to leave right now, or that we would have to call security. After this, the patient calmed down, thanked me effusively for sending the man away, and laid back down to rest. I went back to the nurse's room and back to studying the new patient. As I walked back in, my heart stopped. All I felt was panic gripping my heart inside of me. As I stood there not knowing what to do and looking at the surveillance cameras, there was a big shadow standing right in the middle of the frame of the camera that was recording the end of the corridor, right in front of the bedroom that I had just been in. I took one step back and leaned backwards to check if I could see anything there, and there was nothing. I gave the camera another quick glance, and the shadow was still there, standing terrifyingly still in front of this patient's bedroom door. This time, though, when I turned to look directly at the corridor again, this thing was there. For a moment, it felt like everything froze in place, and I just stood there, looking at it like a fool. And then slowly it turned towards me, a pair of strange and dark red eyes showing. It stood like that for a bit, screeched at me, and then flew into the patient's bedroom, slamming the door behind it. My auxiliary nurse jumped awake at the slam of the door and started frantically asking me what was going on. I was out of breath by now. I told her what I had just seen and what had just happened, and she couldn't believe me. I asked her to come with me to the patient's room, and she agreed. I'm starting to become curious. We walked slowly through the corridor, passing every door carefully. I was afraid that anything would come flying at us. When we got to the bedroom that this thing had flown into, I pushed the door without going in, to check for any kind of danger, and immediately felt a breath of freezing air hit me in the face. The aircon was on in every room, but it was set to 23 degrees Celsius, so this was not normal. Nothing came flying at us like I was afraid would happen, but there, right by the patient's bed, there was this shadow. I could tell that it was a man, tall and strong with a top hat over his head. I asked my auxiliary nurse if she could see him, not expecting a no. However, that's what I got. She couldn't see anything standing there, and definitely not as clear as I could. Slowly, the shadow turned towards me again. This time it didn't scream. This time it just slowly dissipated. Immediately, I calmed down. Not only could I not see it anymore, I also couldn't feel it. This sense of calm came over me, and the patient seemed okay, so we left the room and went back to the nurse's room. My colleague went back to sleep, but I didn't rest until I checked the rest of the units to make sure everyone was safe. After that, I couldn't help but stare at the cameras every minute for the rest of the night. Eventually, our shift was over, and that would become the shift with the most intense experience that I ever had. The next day, when nighttime came, and I did all of my rounds, I went inside room 7 to check on the patient. When I came closer to him, I realized he'd passed away. This was my first experience with the shadow man in the top hat, but it wasn't the last, and it's still ongoing. I'm the only one who can see him around the unit, which freaks everyone out. Every single time I see him, it's under the same circumstances. I walk into a patient's room and there's his shadow at the feet of their bed. I wait for a little while until he turns to me and dissipates. Around 1 or 2 days later, the patient passes away. This is a real story, and it's something that I have to live with almost every day now. I'm not sure if this thing is killing people or announcing their deaths, but if you are a nurse in a similar unit or know someone who is, please share this with them and comment what you know about it. I need to know what this is, how to deal with it, and if anyone else has experienced the same thing. even if it's a different looking entity. I can keep you updated on here if people are engaging and want to know more. Let me know if you want any updates, and I'll make sure to bring them. If you're dealing with something like this yourself, know that you're not the only one. Maybe this will help you feel less afraid. I have a thing that happened to me that I'm not really sure how to categorize, but I thought I would send it your way because I know you'll have a place for it. I used to work at a really old library in my small town. It was a quaint little building that had been updated and renovated so many times that it was pretty much a brand new building. You know that old saying about replacing parts of an old ship until it's a completely new ship? Yeah, it was like that. It was a neat little place. One I was glad my town actually spent money on, because we were always busy. This was a long time ago, before the internet was a huge thing for everyone all the time, and we were one of the first public places here to actually have computers connected to the internet. Not really relevant, but it does give you a sense of place and time, I suppose. The thing about the library was that, while it was part of the town, it was built closer to the outskirts. So, the building itself was sitting there at the end of a road, with a modest parking lot out front. But behind and beside it was nothing but woods. Come October, the entire place was absolutely gorgeous. All the trees would turn at the same time, and would paint this picturesque scene of an older-looking building in the autumn woods. This whole thing actually happened at the beginning of October. I know this because we had just set up a spooky stories display kind of thing in the kids section, which we did on the last day of September. On this day, my coworker that helped me man the fort until close, Susan, had called in. So it was just me working the entire place until we closed at 9. Not really a complaint. It was a Monday, and I knew that we were going to be pretty slow, so I wasn't overly concerned with that fact. Around 8 p.m., I was in the main section reshelving some books when some guy walked in. He looked kind of off. Like, he seemed pretty normal at first glance, but then it kind of clicked that he looked like he was wired and breathing heavily. It looked like he'd been running to get here. Like, full-on sprint. But while wearing jeans and a button-down shirt that looked like it needed to go through the wash a couple of times to get rid of the pit stains. I eyed him as he walked in and looked around the library from the door, almost in a panic. I stopped what I was doing and slowly approached him, asking him if I could help. When it finally occurred to him that I was talking to him, and not someone else, which took a strangely long amount of time considering we were completely empty, he cleared his throat and stood up straight like he was trying to act normal. And then, he nodded with a smile. I remember he asked me for books on folklore and religious texts, which were two things that literally no one had ever asked me for in my time working there. I motioned towards one of the back corner shelves and said that religious texts would be back there, and that a few shelves forward should be the folklore books. He thanked me and immediately made his way to the back corner. As he started walking there, I went ahead and informed him that we would be closing within the hour, so I was going to be doing a lot of sorting and cleaning, but if he had any questions to just holler out since we were empty. Then, I went back to doing what I needed to do for closing and figured that that was that. About 30 minutes later, he shouted out, asking for me, and I went over to the front desk. This guy had 7 or 8 books on random folklores and copies of like 4 different religious texts. I made a joke about how he was going to be doing a lot of reading over the next couple of weeks. And he just stared at me with the most serious of stares and said, "You don't understand. What's lurking out there? I need these for my protection." A bit heavy if you ask me, but I nodded and said, "Hey, I get it. Faith can be a powerful thing." He nodded in agreement, like what I had just said was the most profound thing he'd ever heard. I finished scanning in the books, scanned his card, and printed off the slip for the due dates of the books. I also mentioned to him that if he needed any of them extended for an extra week, he could call us and we could go ahead and do so, since he had so many books. He grabbed the books and looked me straight in the eyes for a moment, then, without blinking, said, "Look, you've been very kind to me, so I want to warn you. Something is out there. It only comes out in October, when the moon is hidden." I blinked a few times at him and smiled and then said, "Duly noted. I hope you have a great night and please, stay safe out there." He nodded again and just walked away from the counter and out the door with this ridiculous stack of books. I chuckled to myself, nervously thinking, wow, that was absolutely the weirdest 5 minutes of my life. But then got back to my end of shift duties. Skip ahead the rest of the hour, and I was finished cleaning up and putting books away. I hit the lights and locked the door, and then headed to where my car was parked at the back of the lot. This is where it went from, "This was a weird night," to, "Holy crap, was that dude being serious?" As soon as I put my hand on the door handle to my car, I started to hear movement in the woods behind me. I turned to look, but when I did, whatever this was jumped down behind the tree line so I couldn't see it. Now, I'm not trying to say that this was some kind of cryptid or something, but it was a weirdly shaped thing. It didn't really look like a person, but it also wasn't some kind of beast or monster. I don't know what it was. It almost seemed shapeless. As soon as I saw this thing move away from my line of sight, I got these terrible chills down my spine, like I was instinctually supposed to be afraid of it. I then glanced up at the sky, which was dumb, but when I did, I realized that there was no moon. The sky was filled with clouds, and the moon wasn't visible. At that point, all rational thought went out the window. I jammed my key in my door and jumped into the seat and sped off like a bat out of hell. I sped home, which wasn't exactly a far drive, and I ran into my house, locking the door immediately. It was the stupidest thing. There was no rationality to what the guy had said. There was no way that there was something sinister in the woods that wasn't just a possum or a coyote. But there I was, running from some possibly supernatural entity that was lurking in the woods by the library, because some rando mentioned that there was something out there. Skipping ahead to the next day, when I got to work, I obviously mentioned the whole thing to Susan, who was back after having called in the day prior. She was as confused as I was. About halfway through the shift, the man came in again, with his whole stack of books in hand. At first, I was thinking, is this going to be a regular thing? Like, is he going to end up being a stalker of some sort? But he walked up to the desk in a much calmer way, and placed the books down, and simply said that he needed to return them. I joked and asked if he had changed his mind on needing the protection. He smiled and said, "Oh, no. I was up all night reading through them, and they worked. I took care of it." After the night prior and what he had just said, I was done with this situation. So I just scanned them all back in, put them on the cart, and told him that he was good to go. He thanked me and simply just walked out of the library. Strangely enough, I never saw him again, and I never had any sort of experience with anything creepy outside of the library that wasn't just a random raccoon or possum. Now, I'm not saying that there was a thing that existed out there. I'm not saying that this guy was some kind of demon or spirit hunter or something. But what I am saying is that this was the weirdest thing to have ever happened. And be it a prank, or just some dude on drugs, or maybe even a guy with mental issues. It was the scariest damn thing that I had ever dealt with in my time as a librarian. I have a bit of a creepy story for you, Raven. One that you may be a bit surprised to find hits a bit close to home for you. No, I'm not a creep that's stalking you or anything. I just know that you live in Kansas, as you have mentioned it. And I happened to be on a job in the Kansas City area. I have to travel a lot for work doing network administration for the bank that I work for. And, fun fact, the bank that I work for has a massive data center in a city called Overland Park, just on the outskirts of Kansas City. In October of 2021, I was sent out to head up a major server upgrade for the data center out there. One thing I was a bit surprised to find was just how cold and wet the month of October can be for you all in Kansas. I was born in the South, and while we do get some cold weather, we don't get the half rain, half snow that you guys are plagued with just before Halloween. How do kids go trick-or-treating when it's so damn cold? Anyways, distracting tangents aside, the job was boring. That's not where things happened. I was back at my hotel one night, and it was, of course, raining and cold out. I had the room temp up a little warmer than I should have, but not being used to the cold, I had to. I had wrapped up some reporting that I had to deliver to my boss, so I shut off my laptop and just wanted to spend the night relaxing and doing a whole hell of a lot of nothing. So I sat up on the bed and grabbed the remote to flick through the channels. Nothing was really catching my attention, but after a bit, I landed on a documentary show about haunted places in the US. Ironically, the episode that was on was about a place called Sallie House in Atchison, Kansas. For those that don't know what Sallie House is, it's apparently this notoriously haunted house in Atchison where a young girl named Sally died. It was in the early 1900s, and she was being seen by a doctor in the house for pain in her abdomen. And they botched the appendectomy, and it killed her. Ever since then, the house has been plagued by paranormal activity, a bunch of reports of objects moving, noises, cold spots, and such. There have even been reports of physical attacks on the people that have occupied it. I was oddly drawn into this show, and maybe it's because the house was like 40 minutes away from where I was staying, but it was really interesting to me. Now, obviously watching this documentary isn't a scary story, that'd be silly. What was scary was the feeling I was getting while watching it. The whole time they were talking about the house, what happened, and walking around showing the rooms, I was getting this weird chill down my spine, and the hairs in my arm were standing up. It may sound weird, but I was feeling like I was connected to the house. Not like I knew anything about it, but like I was supposed to be seeing this episode. I'm not trying to say that this was like a past life thing or anything, but there was definitely something, I guess, paranormal about the whole thing. During the episode, I was just immensely gripped by the story. They were showing stuff about EVPs, and pictures that showed figures, and one of the people was even showing off a bruise they had seemingly randomly got while there. It was terrifying. One of the investigators even claimed to have seen Sally's spirit in the room upstairs, a little girl with a white dress that was stained in blood. He then mentioned that when he tried to get closer, she vanished. And this is where I started to get freaked out, because the second he said vanished, the TV in my room shut off. It wasn't like it was on a sleep timer or an inactivity timer or anything, because it had only been about 20 minutes. But the TV just turned off. I jumped a bit, because it kind of freaked me out given the circumstances, but I tried to turn it back on with the remote, only to find that it wasn't working. I was annoyed, obviously. I was getting into the show, and as soon as it was getting good, this would happen. I got up from the bed to turn it back on with the button on the set. The second I reached out to touch the button, I felt this cold air rush across me. And I swear on everything in my life, I felt an icy hand grab the back of my neck. Like, I felt the fingers wrap around the back of my neck and just straight up grab me. I freaked out to the point that I literally fell onto the floor as I flung myself around to see what had touched me. But, of course, there was nothing there. I literally just sat on the floor for like 5 minutes, staring into an empty room, and feeling like I was freezing. At that point, I was done, so I stood up, changed into my pajamas, and jumped under the covers. Like, completely under the covers, including my head. I didn't even turn the light off. I did fall asleep after a bit, so at least I wasn't too freaked out. The next morning, though, actually scared the hell out of me. When I got up and went to the bathroom to do what I needed to do for the day, I looked at myself in the mirror. Much to my surprise, there was a bruise on my neck, just on the side. It looked to be the size and shape of 2 fingers. It was like someone had grabbed me really hard, or hit me with their hand on the side of my neck. It wasn't a super ugly or dark bruise, but it was definitely a dark red with a blue hint, and it was very visible. Thankfully, I had a collared shirt that was able to cover it pretty well, but it was terrifying to know that whatever had touched me was real enough to bruise my skin. That was literally the only paranormal event I experienced in that hotel. Nothing else weird happened for the rest of the week that I had to stay, thankfully. I didn't watch any more TV after that, though. If I wasn't on my laptop, I was sleeping. I didn't want to risk it. Anyways, that's my creepy story that I wanted to share with you, and I thought you would find it even more interesting being so close to you. I'm pretty new to your podcast, and I love it, so please do keep up the great work. Oh, and please do let us know if you ever get the chance to check out the Sally House. It sounds like a downright creepy place. I'm kind of weird. I've always enjoyed road trips, but I've never been one that liked driving long distances. It's like the open road does call to me, but when I get out on the open road, that call changes from the road to the next rest stop, so that I can get some coffee and go to the toilet. I'm the kind of person that has to stop twice every couple of hours, because my bladder is about the size of a golf ball, I swear. Because of this, when I take my road trips, I either stay at a hotel, or, if I'm feeling bold, I will sleep in the parking lot of a highway rest stop that has full access restrooms, or possibly a 24-hour gas station. If there is a station, I always clear it with the employees. They're typically fine with it so long as I don't park in the front, which I never do. I also drive a large SUV, so while the gas mileage sucks when I'm out and about, it's decent when I'm at speed on the highway. And it's spacious enough that I can just put the back seats down and have a makeshift bed. I've got this system down to a science, too. A cozy sleeping bag, a stash of snacks, and my phone on super battery saver mode overnight. What more could a gal need when she's on the road? Well, I guess a co-pilot could be helpful, but nah, I'm a solo rider. On this particular road trip, I was only headed a few hundred miles to one of my high school girlfriend's houses. She was getting married in a month, and I wanted to come down and stay with her for a few days so we could party before she tied the knot. Which was literally just going to be us going to a Boys to Men concert. We weren't going to go crazy. We just wanted to relive our high school years for a night, and then I'd be staying at her place for the rest of the time. I decided that I wanted to drive the whole way instead of fly, because I wanted some time to myself. And, as it always happens, I was on the road at about 9:30 at night, and I started to get that slight pattern of yawn, shake my head, only to yawn again. I was watching the highway marker signs and looking for one that mentioned a rest stop. And a few minutes later, there was one that was indicated as being off the next exit. I pulled over onto the exit ramp, drove down the road to the rest stop. It looked old, a bit worn down, and there was literally zero in ways of modern society, but it was going to do the trick. I parked a couple of spots away from the restrooms, went ahead and did what I needed to do, and then set up the back seat to be my camp for the night. There were a handful of lights on in the parking lot, and the ones on the building itself seemed pretty bright, so I wasn't too terribly concerned. Plus, again, I drive a large SUV. Most people don't see my tank and think it's being driven by a smaller woman. When I got settled in, I took a moment to look out the windows and get a feel for the area. Admittedly, it did look a little sketchy. There were a lot of woods, and it was just a vast, empty parking lot. Well, as vast as a lot of a rest stop typically is. It was actually a slight bit chilling knowing that I was the only person here, and that I was going to be sleeping in the middle of nowhere. The only human on this large plot of land. It's hard to explain, but it's just a bit of a weird feeling, I guess. I shrugged it off. I figured that it was what it was, taped up my curtains, and put my head down for the night. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on gravel outside of my car. I froze and my eyes snapped open. I slowly leaned up and lifted the curtain slightly to look out, but I couldn't see anything. No movement, no people. Just the oppressive darkness and the flickering lights in the lot. I told myself that it was nothing. Probably just an animal or something, or maybe another traveler that had gone to the restroom, and I just didn't see their car right away. I tried to convince myself of that, but honestly, something felt off. You know that feeling you get like your body is reacting to stimuli that you can't see, and you start to get that cold anxiety? Yeah, that was me at that moment. Lying there in a sleeping bag trying to shake the unease that was crawling over me. I tried to close my eyes for a couple of seconds until I heard the steps again. Then I felt this strong need to get out and see if I was just going crazy or if there was something out there. The not knowing was eating me up inside, so I unzipped my bag, grabbed my pepper spray, and slowly opened my back door. When I stepped out, I noticed that there was another car in the lot parked under one of the lights way off, and that there was a third car that was running and was slowly exiting the lot. My mind put the pieces together, and I decided that it was likely that the steps I'd heard were from the person that was driving away, and probably just getting out to use the restroom before heading back out. They had just walked close to my car because of how close I was parked to the building, and there was nothing malicious going on. I let the adrenaline finally wear off, and I decided to go ahead and go back to sleep. I hopped back in, and when I was able to calm down, I closed my eyes and passed clean out. I woke up to my alarm going off at around 6 in the morning. I was glad that nothing else had happened, and thankful that I was just creeped out by shadows. That it was just me freaking out over literally nothing. I got out of the car, did my quick stretch, and noticed that the other car was gone, and it was once again just me in the lot. I went to the restroom, splashed my face, got dressed and brushed my hair, preparing for the day ahead of me. I repacked my backpack back up and stepped out of the restroom, and I exited into a lovely sunrise. That lovely sunrise, as refreshing as it was enough to actually turn my entire morning from what a lovely start to what the absolute hell. As I was standing there, I glanced down at my car, and I saw something sitting on the ground next to my tire, but partially under the car. I tossed my bag in the back seat and then knelt down to look at whatever this thing was. And when it clicked, I felt a bit lightheaded. It was a small box, no longer than a business card holder, a bit thicker though. On one side it looked like there was once a magnet that was stuck to it with glue, or something, and on the other were 3 letters that told me exactly what I was staring at. GPS. This thing was a GPS tracker, and I knew for certain that it wasn't there when I'd parked the night before. I looked up under my car, and sure enough, there were magnets on the underside of the wheel well, like it had been stuck there and just fallen off. Like the glue on the magnets was defective, and the unit just dropped off my car. The unit itself wasn't dirty. It was still shiny and looked to be brand new. The steps of the night before came back to my mind. Had that person that walked by my car tagged it with a GPS unit while I was just lying there? Someone obviously had, and based on how it looked, it had to have happened that night, because there was no dirt or dust on the unit at all. I stared at this thing and my heart was racing. Why had they tagged my car like this? What were they planning? And who were they? I took the unit and I walked into the restroom, and I tossed it straight into the trash can. Whoever was going to be tracking this thing was going to get to track it straight to the dump. I did a once-over on all my other wheel wells to make sure there wasn't another one, and there wasn't. I made sure all of my stuff was packed up, and I got the hell out of there. I have no idea why this person had planted a most likely very expensive GPS unit on my car, but I'm thankful that the glue had failed, and that the unit had fallen off in the parking lot, and that they weren't able to track me. Of course, now I have this annoying habit of checking under my car literally every time I park to make sure that there's nothing there, and thankfully there hasn't been again. The main thought in my mind as to why they would do that is to possibly steal my car, or worse, get to me as a person for whatever reason. Neither of these things are things that would be good, and I'm grateful that nothing ever came of it. However, it definitely made me a much more cautious person. Maybe even a bit paranoid. Back in 2017, I was asked to house sit for a friend while they were out of state for about a week. They lived about an hour away, and thankfully I was already working a hybrid job, and I just had to go to the office twice that week. so I just planned to stay at their place while they were out. They also offered it to me, knowing that driving there daily could add up, so I agreed. I got myself a small vacation, in a way, even though I still had to work. I had actually met Chuck from work, and him and his wife Grace are very kind and generous people. The house they lived in was also very nice, and is in a great neighborhood too. They're both in their late 50s and had 2 grown children, so it was just them living there, which meant that their place was always immaculate, without a single thing out of place. They had a large fish tank in their living room, and 2 cockatiels, which was part of the reason they wanted me there. Anyways, sorry for rambling. I just wanted to include some information about them as well as where I would be staying for some relevance. I got there the day they were leaving, so Chuck could give me the keys and Grace gave me a small list of things to check on for them, or to just watch out for, and then they left. Once they were gone, I checked out the birds and the fish, and then got my laptop out to work some that day in their living room as I watched TV. The first day went as normal as one would expect when you're house sitting. The second day as well. The third day I had to go into the office, so on my way back from work, I picked up some groceries so I could make some simple meals at home and not eat all of their food or takeout. When I got back that night, that's when I started noticing a few things that were off. When I went to put my stuff in the fridge, I noticed the milk was towards the front of the fridge. It was whole milk, and I didn't like drinking whole milk, so I just remembered pushing it back some when I pulled something else out. I also noticed a bowl and a spoon in the sink that I had used that morning when I made oatmeal. However, I had washed it, and I put it in the strainer before I left, not wanting to leave a mess in someone else's home. But as I started thinking about things more, and realizing that I had forgotten to grab something from work, I finally just chalked it up to me thinking that I washed it, and I didn't. And maybe I moved the milk when I was looking for something else. I was already tired, so I just made something quick to eat and settled on the couch for a few hours before I went to bed. As I laid there scrolling through my phone, I started hearing some shuffling sounds. It almost sounded like someone slowly walking against a wall, or maybe I should say crawling along the floor, because it sounded like it was coming from above me. I was pretty tired at that point, but my first thought was maybe they had a mouse in the wall, or possibly in the attic. Their home was far from cluttered, like I mentioned, and probably more on the minimalistic side of things, so I assumed they probably didn't use their attic for storage, or have much reason to go up there. It is entirely possible that they got in somehow and they never noticed, until someone was there for hours at a time. I again told myself not to forget so that I could let them know, and then let myself drift off for the night. I continued to experience that weird shuffling sound, as well as a slight creaking that I chalked up to the house settling. It was an older house, so it was entirely possible. I didn't really want to bother them on their trip, so I thought maybe I would just try to find the entrance to the attic, so that way I could at least confirm my suspicion. Then I could message them after and offer to go get some traps or whatever he would prefer so that he wouldn't have to deal with it right after returning from his vacation. That was on Thursday night, and I knew they were going to be returning on either Saturday or Sunday, so it wasn't going to be much longer anyways. Friday I had to go into the office again, and it was a stressful day. A few things went wrong, and everyone seemed to be in a bad mood or on edge, so by the time I left, I wanted to treat myself for the crazy day that I'd had. I picked up a case of beer and ordered a pizza that would end up getting there at the same time I did. I enjoyed my dinner and drinks, and was pretty well buzzed by the end of it. I'm honestly a lightweight. So instead of checking on the attic and contacting Chuck, I ended up passing out pretty hard on the couch that night. The TV had a timer on it, so it turned off, creating a very comfortable and dark and quiet room. And if the next events hadn't occurred, I probably would have stayed like that all night. I must have been in that state between being asleep and awake when I heard a sound so subtle but so out of place. It sounded like soft scraping, almost like the sound when you pull back the seal on a yogurt container, or something similar with a sealed layer. Sorry if that sounds confusing. Anyways, this caused me to fully open my eyes as I laid there as quietly as possible, trying to grasp what I was hearing. When the noises continued with the sounds of drawers being slowly opened, followed by subtle scraping sounds, I knew that what I was hearing was real, and I was going to have to confront it. It was clear that there was somebody in here with me. The sound was coming from the kitchen, which was on the other side of the wall. I didn't have a weapon on me, so I tried to slowly look around the dark room for anything I could use that looked intimidating. And that's when I spotted the slight silhouette of the candle holder on the coffee table. It was a thin and long tube, basically that came off the base, so I slowly and quietly pulled it off and pulled out the candle. Once armed, I stood up and peeked my head around the wall to see if I could get an idea of who I was dealing with, seeing if I even had a chance, or if I should just run. Seeing the guy hunched over the counter with his back towards me, I could tell that I wouldn't have a hard time if I had to subdue him. I slowly stepped towards him, being as light on my feet as I could. And when I was close enough, I shoved the candle holder into his back, hoping that they wouldn't be able to distinguish that it wasn't a firearm, and I mustered up my most intimidating voice to say, "Don't move." The guy jumped, and I could immediately hear his breath become shaky. I asked him why he was there, and he told me as his voice wavered. I didn't know anyone was here. I'm Terry. This is my parents' home. Please, don't shoot me." At least I knew the candle holder did what I wanted it to. I told him to slowly back up and get face down on the ground, and I put the holder in my back pocket before he could see it. As he got to the ground, he kept pleading with me not to hurt him and begging me to call his parents, and that they would be able to confirm everything. I quickly grabbed my phone from the coffee table, and I must have put quite the scare in him because he didn't even try to get up. I quickly dialed Chuck's number and told him what was happening, feeling bad for calling him so late. His tone quickly changed when I mentioned the name Terry. He asked me to describe what the guy looked like, and as I did, the guy called out from the floor, "It's me, Dad!" I could hear Grace in the background, and Chuck said that that was his son, and then asked to talk to him. I told him he could get up, and he sat at the kitchen table as he spoke to Chuck on my phone. Only hearing one side of the conversation, I could at least piece some things together. He mentioned a spare key and the attic, and after a few pleas, Terry looked pretty defeated, as he handed me the phone back and apologized for scaring me. He slowly walked off towards the back, and I finished my conversation with Chuck. He apologized for his son, and asked that I not call the cops, but to give him an hour or so to get his stuff, and that he would be leaving, but then mentioned to make sure I got the key from him before he does leave. I told him it was no problem, that he could stay there if he needed to, but Chuck was adamant that he needed to go. It was his place and his son's, so I had no right to say otherwise. I told him I would make sure it all happened, and we hung up. Shortly after, Terry came back into the living room, and I was now sitting on the couch, groggy with the lights on. He gave me the key and once again apologized for scaring me, as he thought that I wasn't home, or was at least in the spare bedroom. He admitted that he had been using the key to come and go when they weren't home, and that he helped himself to the food. He didn't go into detail, but he did say that he messed up, and that he'd been staying in the attic without their permission. I shook his hand, told him no hard feelings, and then told him he could take the yogurt that he had already started eating, and another one if he wanted. And he laughed and then thanked me for them, and then he left. After calling Chuck to let him know he was gone, I fell back asleep. This time, in the spare bedroom. When Chuck and Grace returned, Chuck explained to me how Terry had gotten into some pretty bad stuff, and they let him move back in while he got back on his feet. Instead, he stole from them, and other things, so they had to kick him out. Apparently, Terry had made a copy of his key before giving it back to Chuck, and he'd been sneaking back in while sleeping in the attic. He said that he has since gotten professional help, and is doing much better, but man, that was a crazy week for me. I went from thinking I was going to have to break it to my friend that they may have mice in their walls, to actually dealing with an intruder, only to find out that he was harmless and actually my friend's kid. He didn't really talk about his kids much, so I didn't even know what he looked like. I guess I was relieved that he wasn't just a stranger there with malicious intent, but at that moment, I was still pretty terrified, even if I didn't show it. I'm sure I could say the same for Terry, too. I haven't had to stay overnight to house sit somewhere since, but when I do just have to check on the house, I kind of do a once-over, just to make sure that I am indeed alone. I usually don't like driving at night. It gives me the creeps. You can't see anything, and it's when all the weirdos and crackheads like to come out to play. This time around, though, I really didn't have much of a choice. I was driving home during a road trip alone. Normally I would stop somewhere for the night and sleep in the back of the RV, but I was only a state away, and only a few hours from home, so I decided to stay awake and keep trucking till I got there. I stopped at a few gas stations, grabbed some snacks and food. I didn't really like stopping at fast food places too much on road trips, since it's a lot of sitting around and driving. I didn't want to gain a ton of weight. But I was pretty hungry, and the journey was almost over anyways, so I decided to stop at the next fast food place that I saw, which was a McDonald's, and just grab some chicken nuggets. Now, this was around 2 a.m., so basically there was only a car or two in the drive-thru, and almost nobody inside. I pulled up into the first open spot and got out. When I opened the door to the McDonald's, that familiar smell of salt and oil hit me like a ton of bricks, and I realized that I hadn't eaten anything substantial for almost the entire day. So, I got a large meal instead of just the nuggets. Too hungry to wait until I got to my car and eat, I sat down at one of the booths and started digging into my food. A few minutes go by, and I'm munching on my french fries, and I notice a broad, burly man walk in. Flannel, big beard, friendly enough face. He actually tipped his hat to me as he walked by the counter. He ordered and grabbed his food and sat at the table across the restaurant from me. I finished my stuff and went to the bathroom to take a leak before heading back on my journey home. As I'm leaving, I made a mental note that the guy wasn't at the table. The food was also cleared, so he probably just scarfed it down so he could get back on the road like me. But when I got outside, I saw the man on the side of the main road with his thumb out. Not a car in sight. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was just how tired I was, or how kind his face looked. But I yelled over to him asking if he needed a ride. His face lit up, and he trotted over and started shaking my hand, thanking me profusely. He got into the RV, and I asked where it was he needed to go. He said a place called Lakeside Farms, which was actually a small community of houses not far from my own. I told him that was only a 10-minute drive from where my community was, and that I was willing to take him all the way home, which, from where we were, was at least 3 hours on foot. Again, his face was kind and grateful. So, we buckled in and we left. We talked for quite a bit about what we both did for work, where we were coming from, movies, comics. He had interest in a lot of the nerdy stuff like myself, which you wouldn't glean at all from his lumberjack style of clothing. About halfway through the drive, I finally felt comfortable enough to ask how we ended up 3 hours away from home without a car. Well, I was with another guy, but he ditched me on the side of the road because of a stupid argument we got into. That was back about 20 miles the other way. Been walking ever since. The McDonald's was the first thing I'd seen in hours, the man said. And then I asked, "Not a single car stopped for you the entire time?" "Son, you are the first kind face I've seen since before that argument." I was shocked. Well, I'm glad I could help. At the time, I was thinking of how well it was going, how I should do things like this more often, how it felt kind of good to help someone out that was in need. I'd seen multiple hitchhikers on the side of the road in the many road trips that I've been on, but never once has I stopped, because it was pitch black outside. But something about this man just made me feel like he couldn't hurt a fly. Oh, how wrong I was. We were about 10 minutes out from where his community was. I told him I would take him right up to his house if he wanted, but he said no. That it would be weird if I knew where he lived. Thinking on it, I honestly would have thought the same thing if I was him. So, I obliged, and I dropped him off at the front of his community. Again, he was shaking my hand profusely and thanking me for my gratitude. I felt good, and tired as hell, so I turned around and hoofed it back home. A few days later, I'm in the living room watching TV, flipping through the channels when I see it. The man that I drove home. His mugshot was plastered on every single news channel in the local area. No matter which one I flipped to, there he was. Headline story. It was said on April 22nd, which was just a week ago, he and his roommates were on a road trip out west, and they got into an argument. The friend ditched the man, leaving him stranded at a gas station in rural Kentucky. The man made it home on the night of April 25th, which was the night that I picked him up, and then proceeded to slaughter his two roommates, injuring the third, who barely escaped with his life and ran straight to the police. The man was actually still at large. The police chief on the news was asking for anyone who had seen the man since the attack or had any info on his whereabouts to call them immediately. The one thing that consistently hits in my head is when I think about the whole ride home with the man, it was that I couldn't think that he had a violent bone in his body. That's why he didn't attack me. He was kind and as grateful as he appeared. But something in him must have snapped after I let him out. Maybe he talked himself into it, got angry on the walk home. Maybe they argued again, and he just cracked. Whatever the case, I'm glad I didn't get on that guy's bad side. But, on the other hand, if I hadn't offered him a ride, maybe those people would still be alive. I have always been a fan of the open road. Give me a full tank of gas, a playlist on Spotify of some of my favorite tracks, and a destination that gets me as far away from the world I know as possible, and I'm a happy camper. Well, not a camper. I don't like camping. I very much prefer hotels, but that's not really here nor there. So, when I got a chance to drive across the country for a temporary job relocation, I jumped at it. It wasn't a permanent move. It was going to be for a couple of months, most likely, and then things would shift to me moving back to the home office. I was pretty psyched to be living in a new state, even if it was only for a little while. The whole trip there was pretty smooth, for the most part. That is, until I was about halfway through the Midwest, and stopped at a random highway rest stop to take a break. It was a pretty basic rest stop. Nothing too crazy about it. It had a quaint little convenience store on one half, and then a restroom that was only accessible from the outside of the stop. The store was pretty basic. Like a convenience store kind of place. Just chips, soda, maybe a questionable hot dog if you're feeling particularly brave, which I wasn't. I went into the store first, thinking I would grab my stuff and then head over to the restrooms. I got my snacks, my energy drink, and chatted briefly with the two employees behind the counter about the area and where I was headed. They seemed friendly enough. Just your average folks working the late shift at a highway rest stop. After that, I headed over to the restroom. As mentioned, it was detached from the store. It was the same building, but the door to the convenience store was on the far left, and the restrooms were accessible on the far right. The restroom part was a bit unsettling at first glance. It was just basically cold concrete blocks put together to house a plumbing system. You know the restroom buildings that are typically at public parks? It was like that. My guess was that the restroom was built first in concrete, and there was probably something else attached, but they had since made it a modern-looking convenience store instead. I went in, was happy that it was actually pretty clean, and went to the stall to take care of business. And that's when I heard the door creak open, and someone walked into the stall next to me. The creaking in an otherwise silent restroom was a bit unsettling, but nothing about it was weird, really. Probably just another traveler trying to get somewhere overnight like I was. A couple of seconds pass, and I hear this guy cough a bit, and then ask, "Hey, you got a light?" I was a little taken aback. Who asks for a lighter in a public restroom? Was he planning on smoking in the restroom like that with someone else in there? Then, of course, was the question of smoking what? No, sorry, I don't smoke," I replied, a bit direct with my tone, but if he was planning on smoking in an occupied restroom, then that was kind of rude of him. So, it was warranted. He grunted at my response and then sighed, and then there was silence. A long, awkward silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The kind of awkward silence that came to be when a random person in a bathroom stall next to you talks to you. Just when I was about to write it off as some weird and random encounter, I heard what sounded like a splashing sound. Like a liquid being poured on the floor. My first and obvious thought was that this dude was peeing on the floor. But I was immediately corrected in my thoughts when a strong, acrid smell filled the air. Gasoline. My heart started to pound in my chest, and my stomach turned. This guy was pouring large amounts of gasoline in a public restroom? What the hell was he planning? I didn't want to stick around to find out. I quickly finished up, flushed, and bolted out of the stall. I didn't even wash my hands. I just ran right back to the convenience store, yanked the door open, and almost incoherently shouted, "Hey, there's some dude pouring gasoline in the restroom." The two employees looked at each other for a moment like, is this dude high? But I think the panic in my voice and the fact that we had just spoken a few moments ago, and I was completely normal, then lent itself to the validity of my statement. One of them grabbed the phone to call the police, while the other sprinted towards the restrooms. A few tense moments later, he came back, his face pale. "You weren't kidding. That place reeks of gas. Go ahead and call 911. By the time the police arrived, the guy was still in the restroom. He was just sitting there in the stall, completely drenched in gasoline. It was like he was actually waiting for someone else to come in and give him that light that he'd requested, so he could set himself, and I guess the place, ablaze. They got him out and in cuffs, and they had so many questions about the situation. They determined that there was a truck in the parking lot that belonged to him, and they got his information from running the tags. But the cab was completely empty with the exception of a set of keys. It was like he had come to the rest stop with the intentions of doing what he was doing, and that's it. The clerks didn't recognize him, I didn't know who he was, and overall it was just a really weird and confusing and potentially deadly situation. Of course, by the end of this, I was taunted with the horrifying thought. What if I did smoke? What would have gone down if I had been carrying a lighter in my pocket and handed it to him under the stall? Would he have gone through with lighting himself on fire while I was still locked in my little stall next to him? Would I have just been collateral damage for him? I don't know. And I don't like to think about the fact that this was a lucky brush with potential death for me. Thankfully, after the cops left and everything was done, I was able to get back on the road. I felt bad for the employees. They were probably near the end of their shift, and they were then thrown into a deep cleaning situation where they now had to remove the stench of gasoline from the men's restroom. I hope that that guy did get some help, because he needed it. And I hope that those clerks never had to deal with anything like that again. Because, honestly, that was one of the scariest moments of my life. Okay, so, hi, my name's Leia, and this story is about the store that I've worked at for the past 3 years. And, over time, I've learned a lot of things about the background, plus things happening to me and other coworkers. Everyone's name will be kept out of this, as well as the store's name for privacy. For starters, the building is about 40 years old. It's been 2 different stores over that time. The man that built this building had a son with some mental issues and had passed, but apparently used to stay here as a place to live. Myself and my coworkers in our back room have kind of snooped around, I guess, and we found multiple rooms on top of our meat department that, as far as we know, none of the workers know what they lead to, or what's in them, nor how to get to them. We also found a room with old meat grinders in it, which, okay, that's normal, but in the top of that room is a crawl space that leads to a room with a chair, a hole in the wall that, to me, would act as where an AC would go, and old labeled alcohol. But that doesn't explain the other 5 rooms that we can see across the top. The owner now, plus management, didn't know they were there, and they refused to acknowledge nor look at them, which is weird in itself. Basically, what's bringing all this to a head is that here lately, the more we've been finding, the more the store is feeling like we aren't as comfortable as we have been. In the past few weeks, we've been getting more and more activity, and feelings of anxiety. Of course, we always have the little noises of things settling in the store, but personally, things I've heard cannot be passed as that. It's always when we close and all get into the office to talk or calm down. I've heard our meat machines give the first startup sound, sounding like cooler doors are closing, bags falling off of shelves, and checking, but nothing being there. Coworkers have explained that being in the back room alone, they feel something staring at them from where the unknown rooms are. We all see things out of the corner of our eyes and pass it off, until sooner or later we share that we've had this feeling or happening. Tonight was a good night the whole time we were open. As soon as we close, one of us had to finish mopping, so we were all waiting around and messing around as well. I love my coworkers personally, so I thought it would be funny to scare the coworker that was mopping. I did the first time pretty good. The others wanted me to try again a different way, and I made it about halfway to where I was hiding and watching him for a little bit. I watched this poor boy walk to our back room doors, look into the dark window, stare for a little, and jump back. He proceeded mopping away from the doors on the side of our dairy cooler. A box of muffins fell off the complete opposite side of our aisle, and again this poor boy just said, "What the hell?" Now, I was going to scare him, but that scared me enough to leave it alone. He gets finished, and one of our other coworkers reminded that we needed to get his drinks from the back room's cooler. He refused to go back there with us. We didn't think anything of it, as he has autism, and we have a very big understanding. He does not like to go to the produce section with the lights off, which is completely understandable. You have to walk through it to get to our back room, so me and my manager friend for that night went back there to get them for him. We went back there, phone flashlight shining. I get in the cooler and grab his drinks, and we're about to leave, laughing, playing around. Earlier today I found a service bell around in our back room. I didn't think much of it. We have like 4 of them. I'd sat it by our meat department, and me and the manager both hear the bell going off. I personally am a very get-out, panic-later person, so all I did was look at her wide eyes and asked if that was for real. She wouldn't speak, but had the same look, so I knew that everything was wrong. We heard the bell a second time, and then right after that, our pallet jack, if you have too much weight on it, makes a popping noise over and over. That's exactly what we heard. But to me, there was no way that someone could get those back to back, and if they did, they were currently sprinting toward us. So I panicked and ran out, the manager following on my heels. I genuinely cannot decide if all of this was paranormal, or if some things have actually just been hiding overnight in the store. Everyone but the head manager has admitted to feeling weird or having something happen. We just can't figure out why or what is happening, or which realm to blame it on. So if any of you have any ideas of what this could be, or what we should try to feel more comfortable, please let me know. And thank you for reading my story. I love your work so much. Thank you. Hello, long-time lurker on Reddit, specifically for this thread. This isn't my main account due to privacy issues. I'll be posting this on this secondary one. I forgot about this instance until recently, and it may not be the creepiest or most suspenseful events to happen, but it definitely sparked concern at the time. Also, sorry if my writing isn't the best, as I am on mobile. This happened almost 15 years ago, when I was 7. My best friend's mom would babysit my brother and I before and after school. My mom would usually drop us off at her house around 6 a.m., She would make us breakfast, and the three of us would walk to our elementary, that was less than 10 minutes away. For preface, we would walk through an adjacent neighborhood, through this small wooded area that had an enclosed bridge, and that led us to the back of our elementary school. The elementary sits back in a long tree line that runs about half a mile north and another mile south. Anyways, we're about to get to the turn where we walk into the tree line to the bridge, and this guy comes cruising down the street. At first, I don't even think we noticed him considering how young we were, but right when he's about 10 feet away from us, he slows down to virtually 0 mph. There was nothing that stood out about his appearance either. He was middle-aged, white male, very generic. Well, we all stare at the car and start walking super slowly. If we stop, he would stop. If we walked, he would slowly go. During this whole ordeal, he has a blank expression on his face. Not anger, no smirk, just this sinister deadness, almost. This went on for probably 5 minutes, because we were too scared that he would jump out of the car if we turned our backs on him, and I was mainly scared for my little brother. Finally, he speeds off, and we run the rest of the way to school. Immediately, we go to the principal's office, and at this point, we are bawling. We gave them our version of the story, his description, and whatever else a 7-year-old is actually capable of giving. They take action by calling the cops and our parents. The cops come and we explain where it happened and the story again. Then our parents ended up taking us out of school. From then on, we weren't allowed to walk to school anymore, and our babysitter would just take us. The reason this ended up being so creepy is because, apparently, there had been reports around that time of a guy who would sit under the bridge we walked over, right by the school, and watch people. They didn't know if he was homeless or if it was this other guy who we encountered. They never caught the guy, and we never saw him again. Whether this was a more sinister encounter than we thought, or he was just bored, well, we will never know. I do know how bizarre it was, though. Who stares at children that intently while driving by? He even turned his head around as he was driving. By his chance of luck, no other cars drove by during this whole situation. But, weirdo driver, let's not ever meet again. While I was living and studying in the capital of my country, I had a small rented basement of a 1917 built house, next to a nightclub. I was preparing to go to sleep quite early since I had class at 8 a.m. the next day. Right before I fell asleep, I remembered that I forgot to lock the door. But since the city I lived in was generally quite safe, and the only way to get to the entrance of my place was past a front gate, all around to the other side of the house and down some stairs, I didn't think much of it and proceeded to fall asleep. Skip forward to the middle of the night. I wake up and feel someone or something slowly pulling my blanket off of me. In a confused state, I extend my hand and feel a hairy male arm under my fingers. My first thought was, oh, this is probably my drunk flatmate. But then I remembered that he's at his girlfriend's place on the other side of town. In pitch black, I jump from my bed, rush to the light switch, and as I turn it on, I find a stranger. He's around my age, student, standing in his underwear by my bed, with his underwear clearly wet from urine. My initial reaction was to stay calm, since I had no idea if this dude was violent or what was even going on in the first place. I calmly asked him, "Hey man, what the are you doing here?" He was clearly very confused as well and took a sit on a recliner I had in my tiny room. And there we are, both in our underwear, him covered in urine, and I on the border of peeing myself. And what does he do? He extends his hand and introduces himself to me. At that point, I go, "Okay, dude, get out of my house," and start escorting him to the hallway, where I find all of his clothes and shoes on the floor. As I'm escorting him out, he goes into the bathroom and locks himself inside. I hear him turn on the shower and proceed to knock on the door, saying, "Hey, man, if you don't leave right now, I'm gonna call the cops." To which he replies, "I'm not afraid of the police." Well, that's just perfect, isn't it? A few minutes pass and he steps out of the bathroom, butt naked, with my flatmate's towel around his waist. He looks at me looking kind of content and says, "Hey, did you see? They got a shower here." At that point, I'm fuming. Who's got a shower, a-hole? This is my house. You're a total stranger and you broke into my place. Suddenly, an expression of complete fear appears on his face. Oh my god. What have I done? Jesus Christ. He starts exclaiming as he is very awkwardly trying to get dressed in the hallway. Then I manage to get him out of the house. I even called one of his friends from my phone to come pick him up at the club. It turns out, he's from a completely other town, and came to party to the capital, got kicked out of the club for starting a fight, and somehow managed to get into my place. To this day, I have no idea what he was on, or how the hell he managed to find my apartment, as it is quite hidden from the street. Anyways, I apologize for the long post. I'm not even sure if this is the right place to post this, but I found it extremely creepy. Let's just say that I never forgot to lock the door from that day. P.S. I didn't sleep well for weeks after. No, and I should add that I actually found the dude on Facebook a while later. Turns out, we have a mutual friend. I used to hang out with my cousin a lot. We were both 10 and male at the time of this encounter, and I'm now 33. It has stayed with me ever since. We would mostly spend our youth roaming the streets, not causing trouble, but kicking footballs around fields, climbing, hanging out with kids our age, the typical stuff before iPads and Netflix became commonplace. One day we decided to go and explore a part of the town that we had never explored before. It meant going through alleys and back streets. The trail would actually end approximately 2 to 3 minutes from my house, which was a safe part of the neighborhood. It was a sunny day, albeit not too warm, and my cousin and I had been walking for what seemed like miles. The journey we'd planned was supposed to go on for longer, but we'd gotten bored and decided to take a detour home. The detour involved cutting through an alleyway that looked a little bit like the Coronation Street General, if anyone is familiar with the TV show. To the left of us were terraced houses, and to the right of us were steel fences with sharp points to deter any would-be thieves. We continued up here, and soon enough, one of the kids from our school lived there, and his mom shouted, "What are you boys doing here?" We ran, and I don't know why. We just didn't like her son, and her tone was accusatory. As we ran, we bumped into another kid. "Don't go that way," he said, as his voice trailed off as he ran further and farther away from us, down the opposite end of the alleyway. We shrugged and continued on. It got darker with the trees and the foliage, but we soon emerged from the alley. And that's when we saw the lone boy. A boy aged 10 to 12 just stood there. His eyes were empty. He had a vacant look on his face. Well, the half of his face that we could see well enough. Above his mouth was covered with a veil, somewhat like a Halloween mask of some description. Except it was June. Halloween was still months away. As we got closer, we noticed the boy had a kitchen knife in his hands. I mean a fully real stainless steel kitchen knife. Both hands on the handle. The sunlight made the blade glisten. We cracked a joke like, "Are you cooking outside?" But he looked at us blankly. No emotion, nothing. We were too freaked out to move. And that's when we realized that he hadn't moved either. Not a muscle. We saw him blink, but physically the knife hadn't been raised up or pointed at us, just held closely to his chest, blade pointing upwards. We figured that we should get away because instinct told us that this was weird and a bit freaky. Going back down the alley didn't seem like a safe option. Being stuck in an alleyway with a strange kid with a knife didn't seem smart. In front of us was a road on a steep hill. It was our best bet. We walked up to the top of the hill, just keeping an eye on the kid. The top of the hill was 2 to 3 minutes from my house in terms of distance. At last we felt safe. As we looked back down the hill, the lone kid had put the knife by his leg, now holding it in one hand, but remained in the exact same spot and stared right back at us, expressionless. We told our parents what had happened, and they called a local community enforcement team to scout the area. Apparently, the kid was found with the knife, but we never heard why he was there or what he was doing. 23 years after this all happened, and it is still on my mind. When I was 18, so back in 2005, my mom was giving me a ride to work. My car had been impounded for something stupid, and I had to wait 30 days to get it back. In the meantime, my mom was giving me rides to work. On Saturdays, I worked morning shift, so I had to be at work by 5 a.m. That means that we had to leave the house no later than 4:30. It was still dark outside, like pitch black and very cold. That morning, as my mom was driving me to work, from a distance I could see a figure getting ready to cross the road, basically jaywalk in front of us. As we got closer, I could see that it was a young girl. I thought to myself, damn, caught her doing the walk of shame, huh? She had no shoes, a long white shirt, like she was wearing a man's white tee. It was big on her. It looked like she had no pants on, but you could barely see that she had these short jean shorts under her large shirt. Like the kind that used to be pants, but she cut herself to make into shorts. She wasn't wearing shoes. My mom started talking crap in Spanish. Like, what kind of girl walks around the streets at this hour dressed like that? She was now walking in the middle of the street, super slow, to the point that my mom had to stop like 10 feet away from her because she was now in the street blocking us. When my mom stopped the car, the girl came to a complete stop, but wasn't facing us. She was facing in the direction that she was crossing from my right to left. As now we were close, I could see that her skin was a real bluish gray, and her hair was black. It looked wet and tangled, like she had just gotten out of the shower. My mom was about to honk at her when she slowly turned her head to look right at us. Her hair was covering her face, and she looked like the girl from The Ring. The part that I will never forget was that she moved her hair out of the way, and she had no face. Like nothing. It was just all smooth, like Slenderman. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. It just looked smooth. My mom started to have a panic attack, and I literally felt my heart drop. I now was focused on calming my mom down. The girl looked at us for like 2 to 3 seconds, and then just took off running. It didn't move at irregular speeds, but now it was active. I'd never seen anything like that in my life, and to this day, my mom and I cannot explain what that was. I guess I'm sharing my story in hopes that maybe someone else has seen something similar. Something with no face. I've always had problems falling asleep and resting before bedtime. My pops would take me out with him in the car, and by the time we got back home, I would be asleep. I'm not sure whether it's the sound of the car or just listening to the music in the dark that does it. I'm now in my mid-40s, and I still do this whenever I want to clear my head. Obviously, I don't fall asleep while driving. There's a long twisted road that I usually travel on when I visit my family's farm in the countryside. It's usually 6 hours by car. Normally, my wife and I will take turns driving, or I will regularly take rests. We were running late, and so I was powered by really strong coffee, and it was obviously nighttime. I drove slower than I would have liked. If I wasn't there with my wife and kid, I would have gone as fast as I could. It was getting later, and I glanced over at my wife, only to see that she was completely asleep. I could hear her faintly snoring, and both the kids looked like they were also asleep in the back seat. It was nice to have some quiet. My phone was playing music. I can't remember what the song was, but then the Bluetooth started seeming like it was acting up. I tapped on the dashboard and complained that it was messing up. Then, it stopped working completely. I thought that we must have just lost reception, but it had never happened on this road before. Also, losing reception wouldn't necessarily affect the Bluetooth. I looked over to the side of the road and slowed down when I saw another car. It was an older model, almost like the old rusted ones outside the barns at my family farm. We kept them as farm decorations. But this one, it looked new. I nodded, lifted my hand to wave as I'd been taught, and I noticed there were people sitting inside. They looked shocked and were pointing at my car. They also looked like they were ready to go to a 1950s convention. What the hell? I kept driving and noticed that the houses and farms along the side looked different. The thing that nearly caused me to crash was at the old Wilson's place. It had been burnt down in the 1960s or 70s. The ruin was something that we would play in as kids, hang out in as teenagers, and get chased away. All the personal belongings were left behind, and none of the locals would steal or vandalize a neighbor's property. Most of the family died in the fire, and the remaining family couldn't handle being near it, so it just sat abandoned. But it was there. I reached over and tapped my wife's arm, and then a little harder, but she wasn't waking up. I kept driving when I randomly saw a police light behind me, and it wasn't quite safe to pull over just yet. This couldn't be real, I thought to myself. I had to wait until the turn so that I could pull to the side of the road. Then, after a few seconds, my phone turned back on and the music started playing. I looked in my side view mirror to see the police car had completely disappeared, and the world seemingly went back to normal. I didn't say anything. I drove to my parents' place, and instantly I was chided for not finding somewhere to stop. I was pale and quieter than usual. They asked me if something happened. I told them I was just sleepy, though. My wife would not let up, and while we were in bed together, she asked me what happened. I told her the full story. I didn't leave any details out, but I didn't need to explain about the burnt farmhouse. She'd heard the story plenty of times from my parents. She asked if it was because I was exhausted from the drive, and I was, but she then made a suggestion that I would never have thought of. She told me that there are things called glitches. Sometimes reality doesn't quite work. Either we briefly traveled back in time, or I was somehow part of some kind of memory. Or I was so sleep-deprived that I went to the 1950s and a cop was trying to pull me over. Raven, I've listened to your channel and I've been described for 2 years now, and I would like to know if any of your listeners can tell me what they think happened. It's never happened to me since, and I've driven along that road at least 20 times since that incident, with no issue. From what I know, no one else who has driven on that road has experienced what I did. And unfortunately, due to some privacy reasons, I can't give the name of the road without potentially telling people where my family lives. I do still enjoy going for those late-night drives, though, but they really don't relax me like they used to. Years ago, around a decade back, my friend and I were part of the same Marine Corps Reserve unit. The distance to our unit from my place was a good 2.5 hours. One particular day, we were required to report early. To save time, we decided that I would stay at his place, situated halfway between my home and the drill center. After a night of barracks cuts and a couple of beers, my friend, looking a bit troubled, confided in me about an unusual problem with the house he was renting. He believed it was haunted by a ghost. I, being a skeptic, couldn't help but tease him. But his response was not what I expected. He looked me straight into my eyes and uttered, "It's a damn cat." He recounted incidents where he would wake up to see the cat lounging outside his bedroom. Each time he would leap out of bed to catch it, by the time he would reach the doorway, just 5 to 7 feet away, it would vanish. I laughed it off, attributing it to his imagination, and decided to crash on the living room couch. The stillness of the night was interrupted when I felt something brushing against my hand, which was dangling off the couch. As I peered down, I was met with the sight of a cat affectionately rubbing its head against my hand. Panic set in as I realized I was paralyzed, the dreaded sleep paralysis. While my body was immobile, my willpower drove me to make tiny movements. In a desperate attempt to prove its existence, I managed to grip the cat's face with my index finger, trying to nick my finger on its sharp tooth. Suddenly, the cat wrenched free and darted straight through the living room wall. The moment its tail disappeared, the paralysis lifted. Frantically, I inspected my finger. While there was no visible injury, I could faintly feel where the tooth had pressed against it, and there seemed to be a slight discoloration. The next day, still bewildered, I narrated the previous night's events to my friend. I may never know the truth of that night, but part of me is convinced that I held onto a ghostly feline, even if just for a fleeting moment. The most uncanny thing, it behaved just like an ordinary cat. To this day, this memory remains etched in my mind. This blend of reality and the supernatural challenged my beliefs and perceptions. This happened a couple of years ago. I, 26, female, was walking my dog Indy in my local field. It was dark, but it wasn't late. It was wintertime in the UK, so it was maybe 6 p.m. The field is mainly used for rugby/football, but is completely free to walk through whenever. It's also surrounded by houses and streetlights on the road, but the field itself is dark. So I'd brought a torch with me, mainly so I didn't trod into any dog waste. I've come in one entrance of the field and I'm following the path that leads to another entrance. I used the field to make a loop back around onto the road and back to my house, giving my dog some off-lead time whilst in the field. Anyway, as I'm walking up the field, I notice a figure walk in the exit entrance that I was going to use to leave. I keep my eye on this figure as they have very dark clothing on, and their hood up. I'm shining my torch as I'm walking, so I know the person knows that I'm there as it's very obvious. At first, I wasn't nervous, more so just being vigilant. Indy is a wonderful German Shepherd, so, as you can imagine, I feel pretty safe with her. It wasn't until I saw the person duck down behind a bush or tree. There's lots of new trees and bushes planted sporadically up the part of the field that isn't used for sports, that I absolutely froze. I was about 200 feet from the exit, but would have to walk past the bush they hid behind to get to it. I call Indy over and get her back on the lead so she's close by. By this point, she's also hyper alert due to the person behind the bush. With that, I hear a weird, high-pitched voice that sounded like they were saying my dog's name. I assume they heard me call her, and they said it 3 to 4 times in this longed-out, high-pitched voice. It's clearly coming from the person hiding. Luckily, Indy wasn't reacting to it, as it probably barely sounded like her name to her. I had a moment of, shall I fight or flight? It was either I, 1, run past the bush and try for the exit, 2, turn around and run back into the dark field and make for the other exit, a lot further away, or 3, confront this mofo. Indy at this point is hackles up, ears up, and very alert in front of me, while still maintaining a wonderful sense of calm. I went with number 3. I confronted that mofo. I mustered up every bit of courage and confidence I had, and shouted at the top of my voice, "What the F are you doing?" The hooded man came out from the bush very quickly without saying anything, and I said the same thing again. "What the F are you doing trying to scare a young woman?" I'm so glad that my voice didn't shake or break when I said it, as I was really terrified at this point. He started to stutter and said, I thought you were someone that I knew." I answered back and said, "Who the F hides from someone they think they know in a dark field?" After that, he apologized a couple of times and continued to skulk down the rest of the field, as I made for a swift exit with Indy. God knows what his intentions were. Maybe he thought I had a smaller dog and was going to try to attack me. Maybe he saw Indy and realized no chance. Or maybe he really did think I was someone he knew. Whatever it was weird and scary. I'm new to Reddit, but I figured I would share some of my experience to see if anyone has had anything similar happen to them. I'm a 35-year-old male and currently live in Phoenix, Arizona. I'll try to make this brief and go over a few of my experiences. The first time I can remember anything like this happening to me, I was probably around 15. My family was in the process of moving into a new apartment. Not much was left in our old place besides the essentials, my bed and television. I had decided to stay the night by myself so that I could watch the basketball game. Everything that night seemed the same as it always had. I remember watching the game and opening one of those family-sized Doritos bags. I set the bag down after I ate a few chips, and a few moments later, the bag flew halfway across my room. I picked the bag up and went back to watching the game. I didn't think much of it that night. Maybe I didn't want to think about it at all. At our new apartment, the only thing strange that I remember seeing would be out of the corner of my eye. My dad had a big bright fish tank. I would routinely see the light being completely blocked by something walking in front of it. It would happen while I was in the kitchen doing dishes, and also while I was in my bedroom playing Xbox. One other thing happened to me that I can't explain. I got really lightheaded one time, and my dad laid me down on the couch in the living room. All I could see was white, and I heard, "We are all around you." It scared the living crap out of me, and I just remember thinking that I'm too young to die. Fast forward about 6 years, I had just met my future wife, and after a few months of dating, I had decided to move in with her. We were laying in bed one afternoon, just hanging out. I heard a deep male voice directly in my ear telling me to get out. I looked at her trying to process what I had just experienced. "Did you just hear that?" I asked. "I heard something, but it wasn't loud enough to make out," she told me. We were less than a foot apart, and it was as if someone was yelling directly into my ear, but she couldn't hear what it had said. A few months later, she was driving me to work around 2 a.m. What she told me sent chills down my spine. She said that she had woken up earlier in the night, and something was talking to her. She couldn't understand what it was saying. It was a language that she wasn't familiar with. The thought of something that I couldn't see that close to where I was sleeping was very unsettling. About a year later, we had moved into a new home. I awoke one night to a shadow figure standing above me. I reached out to grab what I perceived to be an intruder, and it took a step back and disappeared. I didn't go back to sleep that night. On another occasion, I was alone in the house on my tablet one evening. I was laying in bed with my bedroom door open, and I heard footsteps in the hall coming towards my bedroom. There were two problems with that. The first being that I didn't believe anyone else was in the house, and the second was that I should have heard the footsteps long before I did. They started halfway down my hallway. I watched the door, and a few moments later, a tall shadow figure passed by. I got up again thinking there was someone in my house that shouldn't be. Both rooms outside of my room had their door closed, and there was nowhere else to go. I opened the bathroom door, and it was empty. I opened the door to the spare bedroom, and it was empty. 6 years later, and I find myself in a new house with a new experience. It was late one night, probably around 11 p.m. My wife was asleep in our bedroom, and I was sitting on a bed in our spare bedroom with the door open. From where I was sitting, I could see down our hallway. It was dark, but not pitch black. As I sat there scrolling on my phone, something out of the corner of my eye caught my attention. I looked into the hallway, and it was empty. I went back to whatever I was doing on my phone, and a few moments later I found myself seeing the same thing. I look and nothing's there. So now I'm back to my phone, but this time I'm trying to focus out of the corner of my eye and figure out what's going on. I then see something crawling in my hallway. It's about 10 feet from where I'm sitting. I look and nothing. I go back to my phone, still trying to view it from my peripheral, and now I see it stand up. It's a woman wearing a white dress. It's walking in a circle, and I'm trying to process what's happening. It sprints at my door, and just as it gets there, I hit the bedroom light and it is gone. Now, I'm sitting there wondering if I just imagined it. The hair on the back of my neck is standing up, and my heart is beating out of my chest. During the height of COVID in 2021, I had to take a plane somewhere for work. Beforehand, I had to self-isolate in a hotel for 2 weeks. During that 2-week period, I was on Discord video chatting with my wife every day, and nothing really happened for the most part. One night, however, we were talking, watching stuff together just like normal. She went to go and take a shower, but just left the camera on. As I'm sitting there chilling on my phone, not looking at the camera, but still had my headset on, I heard a little girl's voice coming through my headset. I forgot specifically what it said, but I do remember hearing giggling. So I turned to the computer and thought, oh, she's just playing a prank on me, haha, very funny. But there was no reply. I then heard the voice sing the classic scary movie trope, the Daisy Daisy song. But towards the end of it, the little girl's voice became 2 voices overlapping with each other, like a man and a girl at the same time, and it became distorted. As this all is happening, I see that the green glow around the border popping up to show the audio is coming from my wife's microphone. I keep trying to say, haha, I know you're there, very funny, and the talking stops. I say, hello, trying to get her to reply, but then the little girl's voice replies back with, hello? At this point, I'm freaking out. I asked another question, but I forgot what it was, and it replied back. I remember it being a pretty simple question. After that, I remember the little girl saying, look behind you, and then laughing. Obviously, at this point, I'm peeing my pants. I did one of those scary movie reactions where I turn around super fast, but nothing was there. Now my wife comes back from the shower. I see her come out of the only hallway we have in our small apartment, so there's no way that she was at the computer. No way that she used a soundboard, which I don't even think she's even heard of what that is before. I didn't end up telling her what happened until I got back. Otherwise, she would have been scared out of her mind by herself. To this day, I get chills thinking about this. I tried searching online to see if people have had their Discords hacked or something that make hackers talk through their mics, but I found nothing. If anyone has any inputs, please tell me, because I haven't found any explanation to this at all. I like to take nightly drives. It helps me clear the BS of the day. Just looking at the passing trees, shortly illuminated by the passing of my headlights. I like to look into the darkness ahead and just let my mind disappear. A lot of the time I put on a set of spooky YouTube stories, like yours, or a podcast to keep my brain going. I've done this every other night after work for the last 4 years, in 2 different towns and 3 different houses. And not one time have I had a single encounter like the one that I'm about to share. I got out of work particularly late that night. Normally I would leave at 6, but I ended up leaving at 8:30 due to some unforeseen work issues. I debated whether or not I should take my night drive like I was planning, or just go home. I usually only drove for about an hour, so I wasn't used to driving at around 9 p.m. But after some thinking, over the previous 11 hours of work, I realized that I really needed some time to just let out all of the garbage that I'd packed into my brain that day. to just let it out into the dark. So, I set out from my job and went straight into what I like to call no brain mode, where I, aside from the obvious paying attention to people and the roads, just shut off my brain and look into the darkness and trees. It's weird to most, but therapeutic as hell for me. As I was driving, I became increasingly aware of a set of headlights behind me. Not unusual, only problem was, the car had their brights on, so it was blasting searing light into my eyes by bouncing off of my rearview mirror. It was impossible to see anything else. The lights were so bright that they were lighting up the road in front of my car. I decided I would pull over when I saw a good spot so that I could let the guy pass. A few minutes down the road, I see a local gas station on the right, and I pull in. I pulled up to the first parking spot, and I went inside to grab a snack. As I was paying for my Doritos, I look over out of the gas station window to see some guy looking and peeking inside of my driver's side window. I quickly finished paying and sprinted out of the store, but when I got near my car, there was nobody there. Realizing I must have just been seeing stuff because it was so dark, I sat there for a moment to catch my breath, unlocked my car, and got in. I pulled out of the parking lot, and just as I was turning right, I saw a car in the parking lot. There were two, actually. One I presumed to be the night shift worker in the gas station's car, but there was no one else in the store itself, and they weren't at a pump. I don't know why that bothered me so much. Maybe it was because I saw, or thought that I saw, a guy looking into my car. Maybe it did actually happen, but he sprinted around the building once he saw I was coming out. Whatever the case was, I didn't want to stay there and find out what actually happened. I continued my drive, not deterred from the weird car guy or the speeding car from earlier. I just snacked on my Doritos and sipped on my Coca-Cola, enjoying a few horror stories on the way. I look at the clock on my dash and notice it's already 10 p.m. It was already pretty late, so I decided to go ahead and go home, not wanting any further encounters with creepy car people. As I'm driving home, I noticed some weird sounds from inside the car. I shut off the stories that I was listening to, but couldn't really hear anything. I started playing them again, and there it was. A little creaking of leather, like someone shifting in a seat. I turned it off and on again, and then I had the bright idea to look in the rear view mirror at an angle. And that's when I saw it. A large mass hunched over in the seat behind me. Whoever that guy was at the gas station, looking into my car, must have broken into my car and locked it while I was catching my breath. I couldn't pull over because he might have been waiting for that. I couldn't call 911 because he would definitely know and I'd be dead. The only thing I could do was text my boyfriend as quietly as I could and tell him to call the cops, and to have them be at the house when I arrived. I managed to get it done safely without the guy moving an inch. I always keep my phone brightness on lows on my drive so it doesn't distract me with personal BS. My heart was pounding. I had 5 minutes until I got home. The anxiety was building. Minutes passed and they felt like hours. The person in the back seat didn't move at all, and then I finally saw it. My apartment building. But the cops weren't there. Either they were on their way, or worse, my boyfriend never got my text. I'd actually told him not to text back, out of fear of the ringers setting off the guy. So I had no idea if he'd actually gotten it. I had to bite the bullet and hope that he had something planned, or that I could run quickly to my apartment before the guy could grab me. Just as I pulled in, my boyfriend comes around the back of the staircase holding a baseball bat in one hand and phone in the other. Right after that, the cops pulled in, sirens blaring, with lights shining on the building. I take my seatbelt off and sprint out of the car towards my boyfriend, not before locking it again when I pulled out my keys and slammed the door. The cops got out, and I screamed at them that there was a man hiding in my back seat. They tried to open it, but I did hit the lock, so I had to unlock it with them with my key, and as soon as I did, the guy sprinted out of the car on the other side, not getting very far before getting tackled by one of the officers. I just sat there on the ground, crying in my boyfriend's arms, thanking him for saving me. I do still go on night drives from time to time, not as often or as late as that night, but now I stop at home and bring my boyfriend with me, just in case.